Welcome to the Rimworld mod rundown. We'll be taking a quick look at what you can expect to see from Combat Extended. For starters, you'll need to own the additional workshop content, Harmony. Today, we've got one of the hardest mods to cover meaningfully, as there is so much around Combat Extended and it's not just numbers or an extra mechanic. It's an entirely new concept, an alteration to playstyle, changing how you approach Rimworld. So this rundown might be a little bit different to what you're used to. There's inevitably going to be more opinion, more vibes, more caveats, and less let's cover everything. I tried to write a script that uses the let's cover everything approach, and it was like eating a cracker sandwich still in a paper wrapper. It's just the most dry, boring explanation of a mod that deserves infinitely more than that. So what you're watching now is without a doubt the most reworked and rewritten script I have ever done. Which says a lot about how I write because there's basically no jokes and I barely put in any fart sounds. I've spent hours reading threads on Reddit looking for answers to questions I had around how certain mechanics worked. I've tested things myself extensively to confirm that what I was writing was accurate. I've bounced things off people on Discord to make sure that my math was correct. And I've started more colony runs for this mod alone than potentially the rest of the current rundown series combined. It's crazy how obsessed I became with wanting to get this thing done right. So I rarely ask for it in my videos, but if you find that this rundown is informative, please give it a thumbs up. Share it if you know anybody else who's struggling getting started with CE, and if you know the mod better than me and I have said any inaccuracies in my coverage, please point them out in the comments section. Let me know what I've done wrong so I can bring attention to it for others to see so I'm not spreading misinformation. What you're about to watch is easily the product of 100, maybe 150 hours of testing and research alone. And as much as I could happily do 100 more, at some point I've got to call it done and get this video finished. I'm hoping all of this work is worth it, because I could have done 5 or 6 other videos in the time it's taken me to cover CE. So I'm really hoping that this turns out to be a positive experience in the end.
Hello, darkness, my old friend.
In terms of addressing that rewriting part, this next part was written before I'd really messed around with Combat Extended. It's here to give you a view of my initial outset and mentality around the mod, any preconceptions I went into it having, and a general baseline as to why it took me nearly 3,000 hours of playing Rimworld to even try CE. I want to make it very clear, this part is not a review. I'll do that bit at the end of the rundown so you can compare and contrast what I went into the mod thinking versus what I came away from it with. If you watch 10 minutes of the video, leave an angry comment and bail because you disagree with me over this preconception, just know it's a weird thing to be upset over. Rimworld to me has never been a game with a worthwhile foundation in combat. Okay, so what do I mean by that? You go to a total war game for large-scale tactical battles, you go to Stardew Valley for farming and relaxation, and you go to Call of Duty for first-person shooting and racial slurs. But you wouldn't jump on Total War for a deep diplomacy situation, or head to Stardew Valley for the randomness of its characters and events, or use Call of Duty voice comms to have a civil conversation. These games all do their one thing extremely well, and the rest of the mechanics or features around that core are acceptable, because it nailed its focus out of the park. For me at least, the focus of Rimworld has never been the combat. It's the random generation and development of your story that, even after thousands of hours, can still be completely different time after time. There are always more scenarios, more restrictions, more planets, colonists, designs, goals, themes, challenges, and disasters. Are all of the stories that I've played in Rimworld memorable or epic? No. Much in the same way that every battle in a campaign in a Total War game isn't going to be a banger. Sometimes you hit auto-resolve and move on. But there are those stories that do stand out above the rest and throw down a gauntlet upon their conclusion. Try to match me, try to exceed me, try once again to reach this level of greatness. So why do I not feel that way about Rimworld combat? Why hasn't Combat Extended ever really piqued my interest? I must have had some interesting engagements or firefights in Rimworld at times, sure, but so very few of them stand out as vividly as the colony did overall. I've always considered overhauling combat to be building on one of those mechanics that just works as is. For an awkwardly forced metaphor, because I love using them in my videos, let's break Rimworld down into a meal. Let's say the story and random generation are the main part of the dish, and I don't mean the entire main meal, just one pure individual element. If you've ordered a burger, it's the meat. It's well seasoned, perfectly cooked, exactly as described on the menu. The bun, lettuce, tomato, onions, they're other parts from the main game. They're still enjoyable, but they're not why you ordered the burger. That's going to be things like biomes, animals, combat, social interactions, a lot of extra flavour to add with every bite and make it more enjoyable. Then you have your DLC, these are your side orders, with some being more important than others, but all of them prepared by the chef. Biotech is going to be your chips, or fries if you're a savage. Whilst you could have a burger without them, you know that it's going to be better with. Then royalty is slaw. Some love it, others absolutely hate it and dislike any mod videos made that require it. You know who you are. Ideology is a side order of sauces that are left on the table, something that you can add to your own dish to modify your experience, but you could safely ignore them entirely. Anomaly is cheese. You can order a boatload of it and drown the burger, making the meal all about it, or you can just put a little bit on to give the meal a new twist, or throw it away and keep the burger plain for today. So, it's a lot of waffle. What does this have to do with mods? Some mods are going to be new seasonings added to that rack of sauces. Others are going to be an entirely new side dish you can order. But CE is something different. It's taking an element from the main game that isn't the burger and completely swapping it out. So the raw red onion that was resting just underneath the top bun is now caramelized, slow cooked, sweet and jammy, but it is still just onion on a meal that you've ordered for the burger. For a mod that has so much time, effort and energy poured into it, completely rebalancing and overhauling ranged, melee, armour, inventories and medical procedures, to me at least, it's not why I'm coming to Rimworld. Rimworld combat is kinda jank at a fundamental level, from all of the odd decisions that the AI makes right up to the main balancing system working around more enemies equals harder. The combat is just a functional element, not a core one. It's there to provide a threat in the most straightforward way possible. So what happens when you take a fundamentally awkward mechanic and try to turn it into a new core focus? Is it really going to be just fancy onions? Or is this burger now a double? Have I been sitting on the sidelines with this mod for so long because I couldn't see that actually what it wanted to overhaul always had the potential to be a solid mechanic? Or is all of this just putting lipstick on a pig? So with that preconception in mind, knowing what I know now, it's been a hell of a journey to make sense and come to appreciate what CE does. Grab yourself a drink, settle into your work on the primary monitor while I talk away on your second, and don't forget that I've added chapters for a reason. This video does not need to be finished in one sitting. Let's get started then. What does CE actually do?
Everything! Understood.
It's a complete overhaul of the combat system, as you would expect from the name, but it's more than that. It rebalances the power of weapons and armour to make them feel functional, removing practically all of the RNG or dice roll approach to vanilla combat, where regardless of how strong the cataphract gear that you had equipped was, there was always that teeny tiny chance that a great bow would be able to sneak a shot through the visor and destroy the wearer's brain. Not anymore. Combat is now a more defined metric, something you can actually plan and coordinate around engaging with. It isn't just combat though. Colonists are going to make better use of their inventory. The entire health system has been rebalanced and there's new bits of gear to further enhance these systems' functionality as well. So how the hell do I go about covering this? It's a question I've already asked myself easily a dozen times, so in a perhaps somewhat backward approach, I'm going to cover health, then armour, then weapons, and finally round out the systems by talking about the new inventory. After everything mechanical is out of the way, I'll do a quick rundown of some new bits of gear that are included with CE, whilst doing comparisons of equipment that already exist in vanilla in relevant sections. Well worth saying now, I'm not going to be comparing everything side by side, it's redundant, but I'll go over some core gear as it works in vanilla side by side with its CE counterpart, which will hopefully go a long way in better explaining what the combat rebalances is doing and how the new stats work. As I do with all mod rundowns, I'm looking at this mod and this mod alone. The idea has always been to cover things in a bubble. If you want to go off in the comments because I did it wrong and didn't include some patch, integration or extra mod and that somehow misrepresented CE, feel free, but this is how my coverage has always worked. One more thing before we dive a little bit deeper, mainly for those of you that are watching this and have never used CE or installed it and instantly felt overwhelmed. It's completely normal to enable this mod and initially feel like you're drowning. There is a lot to take in, and you need to remember back what it was like when you first picked up Rimworld and played it for the first time. Don't be afraid to start hitting that big information button on everything and reading through stats. Pause more often than you need to assess the situation, or fall back on more reliable setups instead of your highly refined vanilla playstyle. Whilst other mods might throw in a lot of new gear or structures, they all work with roughly the same logic. CE is requiring that you forget what you already know about Rimworld combat and start anew, and it's incredibly difficult to break some old habits, so you might be fooled into thinking you know better. For another totally ham-fisted metaphor, most mods are like driving in a different city or perhaps even a different country. Things may look different or follow a slightly altered rule, but as long as you know how to drive, you can figure these things out as you go along. Combat Extended is someone handing you the keys to a helicopter at the rental place and then smiling and walking away. After all, it's still transportation. You've driven before, so how hard could this be? Let's start with these new medical systems then, as it goes a long way in explaining why Combat Extended packs a real punch when bullets or blades start flying around. Firstly, and I would argue most importantly, is that death on down chance is straight up gone. If you're into the late game with vanilla raids, with 150 tribal raiders or so turning up and neatly filing one by one into your kill box, you might be scratching your head as to why only 3 of them are left on the floor after the onslaught of bullets, with others being killed outright by a couple of random hits to their arms or legs. This is that death on down chance kicking in with the vanilla logic to stop you creating a sprawling colony within 1 year or so, by killing off any potential recruits regardless of how hurt they actually are. With death on down chance removed, you'll be spoilt for choice after every raid, a whole host of crawling, screaming prospects. Here is where a couple of other changes to health and vitals play a very large part. Firstly, bullets and blades have this funny habit of hitting things called organs when they pass through the human body, something that is somewhat of a rarity in the vanilla game. With Combat Extended, you'll find that lung shots, missing kidneys, blown out livers and torn stomachs are far more common occurrences, with bleed values to match. In vanilla, the largest threat to bleeding is missing limbs, heart or neck shots, with a significant amount of bleeding cuts granting a solid 6 to 8 hours of reaction time in the majority of cases. You've got time to breathe, plan a rescue and get someone dragged to the hospital before you start bandaging them. Combat Extended throws this out of the window, and reminds you that someone pissing blood out of 4 holes they didn't have an hour ago isn't a trivial matter. You'll frequently see bleed percentages at 600, 1000 or even 2000%. A lot of these raiders you may be dropping won't die instantly, but they're almost beyond saving with the damage you've inflicted to their soft squishy body. So with every round or swing potentially causing such horrific wounds, there's this real fear of approaching certain engagements in Combat Extended, as individual hits have so much more potential behind them. Whilst in vanilla you're more likely to be afraid of that one hit potential, when an attack deals 30 or more damage and could potentially remove a major limb in one go, even minor damage in CE can be dangerous if it packs enough penetration. Bullets frequently rip through unarmoured torsos with a devastating effect, immediately dropping the combatant and putting them on a very short ticking clock.
Mike! Oh Jesus, no!
As mistakes inevitably will be made and colonists will die, you'll be thankful for all of the extra squirming raiders after every fight, because you'll frequently find yourself in need of fresh bodies to feed into the mill again. It also means you're more likely to pick up that scalpel and fall back on older, edgier habits, having a portion of your prison dedicated to organ harvesting for the potential recruits that didn't show much promise in terms of stats or traits, as they'll serve you far better as parts to bring your own colonists back to 100%. You'll also find that losing an organ is now, understandably, dangerous. There's this strange bit of logic in vanilla Rimworld that a shot lung is more dangerous than a destroyed lung, as the organ still being present means it counts for pain and bleeding, whereas a completely destroyed organ is removed and seemingly cauterized instantly. It isn't quite that easy now, with a blown out kidney needing clamping and suturing to stop the bleed. The question of course is that with all of this potential damage, how do colonists not get utterly obliterated by a single shot? Simple, the base values for limbs are now a little bit tankier, so pawns are significantly less likely to have their arms or legs blown off by a single rifle round, with the torso being strong enough that they'll almost certainly have collapsed from pain or wounds inflicted before it can be completely destroyed from gunfire. Of course, the neck is still a vulnerable spot, as is the head, so whilst it can take a little bit more punishment, nobody is exactly shrugging off a 50 caliber bullet to the throat. How exactly do we handle all of this damage then? If wounds are more likely to penetrate flesh and bleeds are more dangerous, that's only going to leave a couple of hours at most to save any colonists with damage that serious, which, given the move speed penalty for carrying a pawn and the distance to your hospital, as well as the time needed to grab medicine and then tend to the wounds, it's practically a death sentence. There must be a way to save these people. That's where Stabilization comes in. If you've used the vanilla mod for this effect, CE's is a lot less powerful in comparison, with vanilla Stabilization essentially functioning as a field treatment rather than an emergency dressing. Stabilizing a colonist in CE will require medicine, packing the wound with gauze, bandages, herbs, ripped cloth, or sealing gels, whatever you imagine it to be, in a desperate attempt to slow the bleeding and give you more time to save the patient. This effect is temporary, as eventually the wound will bleed through whatever the staunching medium you put in place was, and it'll be just as dangerous as it was originally. But stabilizing someone does buy you a little bit of time. The amount of time depends on a few things: the skill of the doctor, the medicine that they used, and the severity of the wound. Whilst a couple of shallow bullet wounds to the shoulder or small cuts across the leg are easy enough to tie off and keep pressure on, a missing hand or a stab to the lung isn't the easiest thing to dress when time is of the essence, especially if the doctor doesn't know their arse from their elbow and is trying to fill the wound with medical herbs. But sometimes anything is better than nothing, with stabilising the wound hopefully slowing the bleeding just enough to give someone time to fireman carry the wounded back to a hospital bed, where they can then be professionally tended, cleaning, suturing and dressing the wound thoroughly so that it sticks. So, not too bad, right? The medical system overhaul makes a lot of sense in terms of providing a visceral punch to the combat. The first firefight I got into with CE very quickly changed my perspective on how I approach the enemy with a gun. Watching bullets whip past my colonist's head with lightning speed made me pause to plan my movements with a little bit more caution, and then when the first shot landed, dropping someone instantly from the pain of being hit in the liver with just hours left to live, I paused the game, leant back in my chair, and had an audible "wait, what?" moment. This was a genie with an auto pistol, firing, almost blindly, at my tribespeople whilst arrows passed harmlessly by him, with the occasional hit bouncing off his flak jacket. Breathe. It's just one guy. Unpause and another shot lands. It removes an eye from my builder. Just what is happening here? I have 5 people loosing arrows at this scrawny bastard, and he leans out from behind a tree and seemingly pulls the trigger until his gun clicks without any consideration for what his target actually is. And he's winning? When an arrow finally did hit the mark, I almost couldn't believe what I was seeing. His bullets had been shredding through my own pawns like a hot knife through butter, so imagine my surprise when it caused little more than a trivial bruise to his leg, falling almost comically at his feet. Wounds matter in CE. Fights matter in CE. A lucky arrow to the genie's thin, unprotected head was enough to bring his wimpy ass down eventually, but by that point the damage was done. I had one colonist who was permanently maimed, another was knocking on death's door, and a third had a bullet in their shoulder, struggling to draw the string on their short bow as blood ran down their arm. The health panel is going to rapidly become something that you tentatively open when a hit lands, sucking air through your teeth at the new, grim consequence of every successful blow.
Die, you motherfucker!
Now that we know how dangerous these new wounds can be, let's cover how to go about preventing them and talk armour. I'm assuming as a baseline you know roughly, if not exactly, how vanilla armour works with its percentage based roll system. If you haven't got a clue, the most basic description is that bigger number equals better for armour, but even mitigated blows are normally doing something. So whilst marine gear will pretty reliably shrug off an arrow, it's still likely to leave a bruise or even crack a bone, and that's just not the case in Combat Extended, at all. I'll quickly go over all the stats first, and then we'll dive a little bit deeper into all of them after an overview. Instead of sharp and blunt armor being a percentage, you now have RHA and MPA. Whilst unnecessary to know, if you're like me and can't help but Google this stuff to find out what it's actually referring to, RHA is rolled homogeneous armor. Whilst more typically used in reference to older vehicle armors, like on tanks, it's working in smaller values in relation to the thickness of the armor that your colonists are wearing, basically explaining how much penetration depth is needed to cleanly punch through the armor. MPA, on the other hand, is used when referring to the amount of pressure an armor plate can withstand before failing, measured in megapascals. You can extrapolate all kinds of formulas out from this if you'd rather think of it in bar or kilograms per centimeter squared, but all you need to know is bigger number is better. The difference in these two can be thought of visually as trying to put a nail through a sheet of metal, versus just straight up hitting that sheet with the flat of the hammer. The nail is trying to punch a hole through, and if successful it will maintain its point, whilst the hammer is trying to deform the entire area that is struck, with the damage underneath it being more collateral in nature. Heat armor is treated a little bit differently, but still runs on a percentage based system, as well as working towards both incendiary and cryo weapons, so it's more rounded in its insulation than only working on the upper extremities of temperatures. If the heat armor hits 100% on a body part, that part is completely immune to damage of that type, so a legendary Cataphract helmet and armor set provides complete immunity, by themselves, to the head and body. Below that quality, additional layers would be required to further offset the potential temperature damage, with the head posing the greatest challenge of all, as its potential layers are only covered by the Cataphract helmet, so burn or frostbite wounds are always a potential risk to the colonist's face. Insulation remains unchanged for armour, and it's the same with things like equip delays too, so these don't need elaborating on. But another part that you might have noticed that's been changed is any move speed penalties are removed, instead replaced with an offset known as worn bulk and weight. All clothing has bulk, some far more than others, so whilst you can easily move in pants and a t-shirt, throwing on a chunky flak jacket or a heavy ceramic plate vest is going to impact that freedom of movement, which in turn has a knock-on effect on a lot of modifiers within a colonist's information panel, especially global work speed. So that's the basics. Let's break it down a little bit further and try and keep it simple. As if you mouse over the sharp armor stat, it pops up a nightmarish explanation. Sharp armor for some parts is going to display as a range. In this case, we'll use a cloth flak jacket, which yes, I'm going to address shortly. It's showing between 1.63 to 2.04 millimeters of RHA. Gear with a range like this will typically show in the sharp armor information page at the bottom the reasoning behind it, with the flak jacket providing the lower amount of armor at the neck, and the higher values applying across the torso, shoulders and arms, which makes sense. It's harder to get the same thickness of protection wrapped around a mobile area like the neck without significantly impacting the range of motion. These values still work in layers, so if a pawn is wearing a shirt, vest and jacket, a projectile is going to have to try and penetrate outer, middle, then skin, with it working on a sensible formula that's a nightmare to parse visually at first glance. It does work as you'd expect though, it's just not super easy to verbalise. Every strike or projectile is going to deal an amount of armour penetration, with one of the cleanest examples to work with potentially being the steel simple helmet, as it's only a single layer of armour with very exact numbers, so we'll grab that. You can see that it's 4mm thick, so an attack is going to need to penetrate at least 4mm to still inflict any sharp damage. Again, we want to try and work with relatively simple numbers for this example, so we're going to grab the basic revolver. Don't sweat too much over it having different ammo types just yet, we're going to cover that later. For now, we're going to assume it's using full metal jacket. This is listed at the top and it does 6mm of penetration, which is enough to go through that helmet, with 2mm of penetration remaining. Using the formula given by the armour description, we've now got some numbers that we can throw into it. So we know that if the penetration is higher than the armour, its damage is reduced to the ratio of the remaining penetration. 6mm of penetration, 2mm remaining, means it's going to deal 33% of its potential damage. That 15 damage becomes 5, still applying a gunshot wound too. It's a sharp attack after all. But that isn't all of it. Whilst the projectile made it through the armour, the plate itself still took a large amount of force. If you remember the nail and hammer analogy, the nail is going to hurt, but it doesn't nullify the blow struck by the hammer that drove it through the surface. The hammer in this case is the 10 damage of that potential 15 that was negated by the armour, with there being a calculation to determine how this blocked sharp damage is then converted into blunt damage, and then rolled against the blunt armour after converting it into the modified blunt armour penetration, which is different from raw blunt armour penetration values. So alongside the bullet wound to the head, you'll notice the full metal jacket is also reliably leaving a bruise of around 2 damage. Going into the exact formula for this is kind of nuts, and you'll see if we swap to AP ammo, there are some strange swings and roundabouts. If instead that revolver is using armour piercing rounds, it's punching through 12mm of armour instead, so it's greatly exceeding that 4mm of sharp armour. With 66% of its penetration value remaining, it deals 66% of its 10 potential damage, and hits for around 6.6, slightly more than the full metal jacket would have done on the gunshot wound. However, because less of the attack has been mitigated by the armour, and it's dealing less damage overall, you're no longer getting that additional blunt strike. The bullet is sailing cleanly through the helmet to find its target, rather than the raw power approach that the full metal jacket round was using. So you technically deal more damage with the full metal jacket against armour of this thickness, with an AP round being more reliable if it lands against another, potentially more heavily armoured body part. Finally, we've got hollow points. These throw a spanner into the works and bring us to the next part of working things out. What happens when a sharp attack isn't able to penetrate through the armour at all? Hollow points only have a penetration of 3mm, so they're 1mm short. Now we need to look at the formula for modified blunt armour penetration. This is going to get super math heavy for a second, so if you aren't a fan of numbers, this is going to sound like white noise. The entire shot is being mitigated, so our blunt armour penetration is 23.28, that's the default value. Then we need to figure out the blunt damage, so that's the penetration value times 10 to the exponent of a third. Yeah, it comes out to around 6.15. That's the damage, but we've still not actually rolled against armour. 23.28 penetration against 6 MPA results in 74% of the attack being left unmitigated, with 74% of 6.15 bringing us to the damage dealt, 4.6. Now that's just a hell of a lot of steps to go through as a sane human being to work this stuff out, but it goes some way in explaining why we had that overflow damage from the full metal jacket round but not the AP, with it coming from that very first bit of the formula. It's the modified blunt armour penetration from the total stopped penetration being divided by the initial penetration, meaning basically that AP round is throwing much more of its potential force through the target, with the full metal jacket dealing more of a mushroom effect on impact.
Holy cow, I'm white and dirty.
So what if sharp armour and blunt armour are high enough to negate that sharp hit? It's deflected, plain and simple. There's no RNG rolling on the damage side of ranged attacks in CE, so whilst all attacks still have a hit or miss chance and can potentially land on a variety of body parts, if a blow does land, it's following a very specific formula to determine how it behaves and, most importantly, if it hurts. Of course, whilst armour may be capable of bouncing attacks off its surface and protecting the delicate meat bag within, it doesn't exactly do a world of good to be sprayed with multiple rounds of small caliber repeatedly, forming cracks, defects and weaknesses within the plates. There's a small explanation of how this condition damage works at the bottom of the sharp armour description. Any hard armours, gear that's been made with metal basically, take more condition damage the closer the attack's penetration was to their sharp armour. So an arrow fired at marine gear is going to harmlessly glance off. It lacks any meaningful kinetic punch to even scuff the paint job on the outer plates. However, some 5.56 rounds fired from an assault rifle are going to deal considerably more damage against the armour itself, potentially revealing some weaknesses as more bullets land and ceramic starts to shatter. As while sharp armour can be effective, it's going to lose thickness as the durability of the piece falls, meaning that what may have been an impenetrable bulwark to begin with can be torn down over time via concentrated firepower and sheer determination, eventually giving way to letting damage creep through. But that's only counting hard armour. What about layers your colonists are wearing made from leather, devil strand or cloth? These layers are far more susceptible to damage from sharp blows, be that a strike from a sword or a bullet ripping through them. They will take either the amount of damage that was stopped by the sharp armour, or 20% of the inflicted damage, whatever was greater. A piece of cloth tribal wear is going to stop nothing, so it makes very little sense for it to be practically unscathed when a monosword cleaves through the chest of the wearer. It's why instead it's going to take 20% of the inflicted damage, as the blow effortlessly sunk through both clothing and flesh alike. You'll quickly notice in CE that you're going to get through a lot more gear by virtue of how condition damage is managed. You might need to wriggle a few of your crafting builds around to ensure you've always got additional replacement parts, or lean more heavily on mods that include repair mechanics if you're okay with that approach. And all of this has been made considering, for the most part anyway, that this attack is passing through a single layer of armour. What if you're being hit in the chest whilst wearing a Devil Strand flak jacket, composite vest, and a synthread shirt? This actually helps to demonstrate the condition system and explain layering at the same time. Using that same revolver, firing full metal jacket rounds and aiming for centre mass, we know that its 6mm of penetration will make it through the jacket, but some of it's going to be stopped by that sharp armour. It's now becoming a blunt attack before progressing further, using the modified blunt armour penetration value instead, 23.28 the starting point with a total of 4 stopped and 6 initial sharp. This leaves us with 15.52 blunt penetration. It's not enough to get through the vest at its thickest part. You can then see that whilst the jacket takes damage from the initial shots, the vest doesn't. When the jacket has received enough damage, the vest then begins to lose integrity as more of that kinetic force is making it through. When the vest eventually takes enough rounds, bruises begin to show up on the torso. This actually gives more weight to the consideration of the armour's max HP. Whilst armour can still be destroyed in vanilla Rimworld, it's performing the same at 10% as it does at 100%, but things like composite vests in CE provide a massive amount of sharp and blunt armour to the torso, neck and shoulders, with the caveat being they only have a small amount of hit points and will be rendered ineffective very quickly. The jacket can take all of the shots needed to begin damaging the vest and will still last longer once those shots are making it through. So, vests take a handful of shots before they rapidly deteriorate, with the upside being they can completely negate early damage, whereas the jacket can withstand numerous engagements, with the downside being it's not fully stopping anything, just slowing the amount of trauma that's inflicted. This is why multiple layers correctly used will dramatically help in slowing fast, lethal projectiles into manageable blunt trauma. Wearing external ceramic plates which offer a high amount of sharp resistance and then underlaying them with thick absorbent blunt defense is ideal if you're unable to deflect projectiles entirely, as that second punch from the impact is always going to require some form of mitigation. This is assuming that you're potentially using alternative materials or modded armours that work in this way, of course. There's very little stuff in vanilla that provides truly meaningful blunt defense on a skin layer. And all of this is still only really covering sharp attacks or sharp damage that have been converted into blunt. What about straight up blunt damage? It's obviously one of the rarer damage types in the game, with some clear go-tos being the mace or warhammer. So for this, we're equipping these weapons on a colonist with 20 melee and swinging at someone wearing a simple steel helmet.
Hi, I'm Johnny Knoxville. Welcome to Jackass.
Now, you'd normally want to build these weapons out of uranium, but for science we're going to keep them as steel. First up is the mace for a nice, clear demonstration. The steel helmet has 6 MPa of blunt armour, with the head of the mace, the most dangerous part, doing 5.63 MPa of penetration. So whilst a colonist isn't exactly going to enjoy being smacked over the head with a steel mace, it deals absolutely no damage to them until the helmet has taken at least 5 hits, bringing it down to around 75% condition and lowering that blunt protection that it offers to a level that attacks can start making their way through. It's important to note that this can happen because blunt penetration is close enough to the blunt armour to deal conditional damage. If you look in the explanation for conditional damage, you can see that if the penetration is less than half of the armour, it does nothing, as demonstrated by bouncing the mace against some cataphract gear, meaning that a colonist wearing the best of the best armour is essentially impervious to damage from lower caliber weapons or weaker melee armaments. This holds true for sharp converting into blunt, dealing conditional damage too, so an unstoppable killing machine really lives up to the name in Combat Extended, with swings rebounding and bullets ricocheting harmlessly off their gear as they wade into combat to crush their opponents. So knowing that a steel mace isn't going to cut it without multiple swings, let's use something a little bit heavier instead and try with a warhammer. Not only does it do a solid chunk of condition damage to the helmet, more than the mace achieved, it has enough penetration to make it through that 6 MPa of protection. Melee damage, unlike ranged attacks, do have a little bit of variation, so it's going to produce different severities of damage from blow to blow, simulating things like how clean the hit was, how deep the blow struck, or if there was a particularly nasty amount of momentum behind it. It works on a similar system to sharp damage, reducing the overall damage in line with how much penetration remained for the attack. So the Warhammer's 11.25 on the head is being roughly halved by the simple helmet's 6 MPa. That just leaves heat armour, which works on a much more straightforward percentage system than the vanilla variant. In vanilla, 200% heat armour is considered immunity, because of how the random numbers are used to determine if an attack is successful or not, comparing against whether it's under half, over half, or greater than it, with 200% making it impossible to roll anything but under half, negating the damage. This is where I'll briefly mention back to when I talked about a cloth flak vest. Different armours are now stuffable in Combat Extended, meaning you can get things like greater heat immunity, better sharp and blunt defense if you're making your flak gear out of Devil Strand, or if you happen to have enough of it laying around, Hyperweave. So in CE, 100% heat armor quite simply means that you're going to be immune to heat or cold damage, as it's reducing it by 100%. No ifs, ands, or buts. This works exactly as you would think from 0 to 100% as well. If you have 20% heat armor, it's 20% negated. Straightforward, easy, no messing about. And believe me, you're going to be glad it's this straightforward when you see how potentially devastating fire in CE can be, with fuel puddles allowing rapid infernos to overwhelm stationary defenders. That covers the stats, but not necessarily everything associated with armor. Shields are included with CE as a way to assist melee attackers getting into combat when under fire, and they provide defensive bonuses during a brawl. There are 2 types of shield included with the base CE mod, both serving different purposes. The melee shield is more focused for face-to-face combat, whereas the ballistic shield is a wall of protection. And these can work with both one-handed melee weapons and one-handed firearms, allowing colonists that are using weapons like revolvers or auto pistols to more safely close that distance so that they can start to take aim. Starting with the melee shield, whilst it's only listed as covering the left shoulder when worn, it's actually providing protection to the torso area from projectiles when equipped. Now, this shield is going to deflect things like arrows, with some great bow shots potentially having just enough punch to get through even a steel version, but it's going to do very little when it comes to stopping a bullet. The main upsides to the melee shield are in its offsets when equipped. Some of these stats are familiar from vanilla, like melee hit chance, whereas others are entirely new, like parry and critical. I'll go over these new stats when doing the breakdown for melee combat, as it's more suited for that section. For now, let's go over what the shield is here for. You'll unlock it via the smithing research, and it's providing melee combatants of a Neolithic or medieval era access to reliable protection at the cost of only being able to wield a one-handed weapon, things like an axe, gladius, equa, or mace. You aren't able to use this alongside spears, warhammers, or longswords, They're not versatile weapons in this game. So you're going to be sacrificing that high-end damage and penetration that a two-handed weapon could offer for the survivability that the shield would grant, most likely allowing your combatant to live long enough to see armour produced that provides ample protection by itself, so they don't even need a shield. A melee shield is far quicker and cheaper to produce than a full suit of plate armour, so whilst it's not going to allow you to stay in a fight for a long time, it can potentially help you stand toe to toe against individual threats and walk away without a scratch. It's worth noting that one-handed weapons do include ranged weapons too, and while you're unlikely to have firearms at this level of technology, peelers, renamed to javelins in CE, are classed as a one-handed thrown weapon. Using them with a shield will make for far less accurate throws, but given their extremely limited range, it makes it much safer if you get caught in melee when trying to wind up an attack with one. The ballistic shield is the second option. Again, it's only listed as covering the left shoulder, and this actually provides protection to the entire head and torso, whilst also being able to protect the legs if the user is considered crouching too. Crouching isn't something that can be toggled on or off. It's a state that pawns are going to adopt when they're drafted and not moving, like taking a knee to make themselves less of a clear target, or in the case of the ballistic shield, hunkering completely behind it so that none of their body is exposed to danger. The ballistic shield is providing considerably more sharp and blunt armour, whilst not needing a great deal more materials to make. It just needs a lot of extra work. As you would expect for these additional bonuses, it does have more impactful offsets. It seriously hampers any ranged combat capabilities if you are trying to use a handgun with it, and it also lowers melee hit chance, due to it making attacks incredibly predictable in terms of their direction. You can't exactly surprise someone with a slashing motion from your left side if there's a hunking great chunk of metal in the way. These shields are fantastic to allow grenadiers to get in close to do their dirty work before you have access to launchers. Just be careful when winding up a throw, as they need to expose their arm to ready the attack, so if you time it poorly, they might see that arm removed from their body. The last bit to mention with armour comes from mechanoid and animal threats, as so far all of this armour has been tied to gear. It isn't inherent to the target. With something like a megasloth, the largest animal you're going to naturally find on your map, you'll discover that its sharp and blunt armour don't really offer much of a challenge anymore, compared to the vanilla values anyway, with it only having 0.07mm of RHA and 0.111 MPA, so even basic stone arrows are going to manage to get small cuts against it, working similarly to how the full metal jacket did against a steel helmet. If you upgrade to simple steel arrows, they easily have enough punch to get through its hide. So what about mega spiders, or thrumbo? Mega spiders have weak legs, with thick chitin shells across the rest of their body, providing 4mm of RHA and 10 MPA. Thrumbo are even heavier, with a whopping 14mm of RHA and 21 MPA, meaning Thrumbo hide is as thick as a composite vest, across their entire body. So against that kind of armour, you don't have that many choices, surely? Not necessarily. Beings like this have a dedicated armour durability value that can be chipped away at by any attack, even if it wouldn't meet the threshold for sharp or blunt armour on worn gear. So a thrumbo locked behind a wall of embrasures will allow even a bunch of tribals with short bows to eventually chip it down. It's just going to take an age. This means that you always have some kind of option against a non-human threat. It's just not going to be ideal, as manhunt animals will be unable to retaliate if you're safely on the other side of a murder hole, but they're unlikely to hang around and let you essentially flick them to death. So where does that leave our mechanoids? They're less chill about you battering them from behind the safety of a few walls, and will return fire and try and flush you out. Not only that, even basic mechanoids like militars boast 2.5mm of RHA across the majority of their body. So if you're going with a tribal start, even the simplest of mechanoids can essentially hold you hostage within your own base. As a crash landed start, you have a couple of starting firearms and whatever else you've managed to scavenge to help, but mechanoids still aren't a pushover. This is where things like Molotovs can help overcome the odds, rather than trying to either chip through their armour durability or rely on a successful shot hitting something vulnerable. Incendiary weapons in CE apply a soaked in Promethium effect, bypassing that mechanoid's natural lack of flammability and allowing blazes to stick to them for a pretty reasonable duration. Whilst mechanoids aren't going to panic like an organic target would whilst on fire, so they're still going to attack you whilst it's happening, the fire causes significant damage throughout their systems as the burning fuel seeps through cracks and gets underneath their armour plating, melting the more vulnerable internal components instead. We'll go over mechanoids a little bit more later, as there's quite a few changes to make them truly terrifying.
It doesn't feel pity, or remorse, or fear, and it absolutely will not stop. Ever. Until you are dead.
Onto the combat side of Combat Extended, starting with ranged. The biggest change to ranged combat is the complete overhaul of projectiles, which isn't exactly something you have control over, but it's dictating how everything is working with firearms and bows. If you haven't used CE before, it's likely going to be something you immediately notice when watching footage of ranged combat. Bullets absolutely whip through the air now. Single blows are often enough to bring somebody down, and entire fields of enemies can be managed by a lone soldier with a BFG. So, what changed? What factors are at play that make a firefight look and feel absolutely brutal? Firstly, projectiles are now following a different ballistics model. Weapons have recoil, sway, spread, and burst fire amounts that have a rapid enough delivery so you find attacks aren't interrupted as frequently as they are in vanilla. The bullets or arrows that are leaving your weapons are checked against appropriate hitboxes, rather than the completely random nature of a vanilla scatter. So while shots can still deviate and miss, they're at least going in the general direction that you were aiming for. You don't get those random 60-degree shots firing out the side of your minigun anymore. Not only that, collateral targets need to be in the line of fire to take damage. Again, removing odd interactions with friendly fire that could seem almost intentional in vanilla due to how extreme the miss had to be. All of this comes with a complete rebalance to weapons roles and intended uses. It sees their damage values, ranges, and saturation potential being modified in a way that makes sense. Not to mention the ammo system that enables you to choose between a variety of payloads, as well as giving you the option of baiting an attacker into exhausting their supply of bullets. If you're feeling brave, anyway. We've got a lot of potential things to cover here, and I said at the top of the video I'm not going to go over every weapon. The same is true for every ammo type. There's going to be a lot of learning and using CE that comes down to following the age-old adage of RTFM. The first major change you'll notice from vanilla to CE is that now weapon stats are broken down over 2 separate entries. So you're going to need to get into the habit of looking in different places to find the values that you're after. For the revolver, the main weapon section is showing burst, caliber, fire rate, recoil, capacity, sights, one-handed allowance, spread, sway and melee stats, with the range section underneath having the more vanilla values of building damage, range, cooldown and aiming time. With weapons that are capable of burst fire, you'll also see the burst shot count and the RPM in this lower section too. With this many new stats looking at you, it becomes understandable why a familiar weapon might feel quite alien to you. Where's the damage? Where's the penetration? What kind of metric is fire rate when I just mentioned that weapons with burst still have RPM? It's time to do a bit by bit breakdown of these, with some being far easier to explain than others, so use chapter markers if you're looking for something specific. First up is burst shot count. It's quite easy and it ties in with the second counter for it that appears in the weapon bracket range section too. As the revolver is incapable of burst, it simply shows 1, without the secondary stat in that lower section. We're going to need something a little bit heavier on the DACA side for this example, so we'll pick up a heavy SMG. You'll see that its burst shot count is 6 at the top, but it's 3-6 underneath. That's because some weapons in CE come with a firing mode, allowing you to more carefully dictate to your colonists how they go about pulling the trigger. They can cycle between auto, which uses the largest number, burst, which hits the lower number, or single shot, which as you would expect, only fires a single shot. Useful if you're running low on ammo and want to make every bullet count. If a weapon is capable of automatic fire, this is where RPM comes into play, working the same way it does in the standard game. A higher RPM means it can spit out its intended burst in a shorter amount of time, meaning the shooter can trigger that ranged cooldown and aiming time even quicker. Weapons with a low RPM can lead to the attacker seeming to be locked into firing at a specific target, with you unable to move them away from danger or quickly swap priority to a bigger threat. That's simple enough. Caliber is where this is going to get a bit more meaty. Every weapon in CE is going to have a size of ammunition that it utilises, while some ammo types are shared across multiple weapons. Now, as a Brit, I grew up with bullets being banned in my schools rather than books, so I might be a touch behind some of my American viewers in terms of my familiarity with these payloads. I look forward to reading your comments about knife crime, tea or teeth. Practically every weapon in CE will have some choice to make in terms of its ammunition, so whilst a revolver does need to use 44 Magnum rounds, it can be either full metal jacket, armour piercing or hollow point, which we used in the armour segment in regards to sharp protection. Some ammo types may be shared across multiple weapons, making them more versatile, or offer more exotic effects. Whilst I was learning the systems in CE, I fell back on the reliable, affordable, and surprisingly effective bolt-action rifle, which uses 303 British rounds. This comes with a host of choices for projectile, including the same full metal jacket, AP or hollow point as the 44 Magnum, whilst also offering armour-piercing incendiary rounds that pack the punch of an AP round but also apply some burn damage to the target, armour-piercing explosive rounds that behave closer to a full metal jacket in terms of their penetration and bullet damage, but provide an extra punch when they hit the target, and finally salvo rounds, which many consider to be a bit of a meme. These do what AP rounds do, but to an extreme degree, at the expense of even lower damage. So whilst there is practically nothing a salvo round can't punch through, it's essentially a high velocity needle at this caliber and leaves only a very small wound. You can change what type of ammunition a weapon is using by selecting the colonist holding the gun, right clicking on the reload icon and picking your preferred type. Hitting the reload button normally will force a standard reload, useful if there's a pause in combat to make sure you're topped up for the next wave, but it also allows you to stagger reloads across your firing line, so there isn't a complete stop to saturation that allows enemies to advance on you. The upside that I got from using 303 British rounds whilst learning the systems was that when I progressed up the tech tree and unlocked LMGs at gas operation, I already had my stockpile of ammunition ready to go. This is where another side of the rebalance and overhaul from CE comes into play. That LMG is still firing the same rounds that the bolt action rifle was, so it's dealing exactly the same amount of damage and penetration, just on a dramatically different scale. Whereas the bolt action rifle was firing a single round at a time, the LMG is upping the potential to a 10 round burst at around 500 RPM. Suddenly that single missed bullet isn't quite so impactful when it's followed up by 9 equally dangerous ones in rapid succession. It's the same story with a pump action shotgun and a chain shotgun, which has seen not only a visual change but also a mechanical one, making it much closer to its real life counterpart, the Saiga 12. If you wanted to focus on more close range engagements and instead build around using 12 gauge, progressing from pump to chain shotguns makes sense, with the major difference being that the chain shotgun no longer has burst fire. It just has a much faster firing cycle than the pump does, with greater ammo capacity. This is where you'll see that with certain calibers of ammunition, like 12 gauge, you actually have 4 extremely different approaches from a single type. Buckshot is capable of peppering a target, with a minor amount of penetration that can be shrugged off by things like flak or even good quality steel. So whilst it absolutely shreds enemies turning up wearing loincloths with its 9 pellets of 8 damage, it barely even staggers someone sensible enough to gear up for combat. That's where your slug shells come in. They fire a single massive lump of damage rather than multiple pellets. It has the same amount of sharp penetration as a 44 Magnum full metal jacket, with over 3 times the blunt penetration, so this knocks the wind out of practically anyone wearing below marine quality gear. It shatters limbs in a couple of good hits. The beanbag is there if you want the opposite effect. It's ideal for dropping prisoners that are attempting to escape, as with the removal of the death on down chance, you can reliably pacify any runners now, instead of somehow killing them with a couple of bruises to the shoulder or the chest. Just make sure you're stripping prisoners of any armour if you want to go this route, as beanbags aren't exactly known for their penetrative qualities. Finally, you've got EMP shells. These give you the versatility to cycle ammo types across your firing line when you're facing mechs. A pocket full of buck, slug and EMP ready to go for all occasions. If you get hit by tribals, load the book. Swap to slugs for outlanders, and then if mechs show up, you can have a couple of people using EMP whilst everyone else batters their plasteel armour with slugs and tries to bring them down through sheer blunt force. So that's Caliber, greatly expanding on the flexibility for every weapon and allowing you to upgrade to a higher tiered firearm without completely wasting your surplus of ammunition. From here we have a somewhat vague concept of fire rate, which is better displayed in the lower section for range stats. A fire rate of 1 corresponds to 60 RPM, with a single shot weapon landing on a firing rate of 4. Essentially, the bigger the number in this firing rate stat, the higher the density of death in the local area will be. Recoil is next, and this, as a stat, has very little explanation in the game when you hover over it directly. On a single fire weapon, recoil is generally going to have been managed by the time another shot has been cycled and aim has been taken. It mainly comes into effect with burst or full auto weapons. So speaking extremely broadly, as there's always going to be exceptions to this rule, the larger the caliber of ammunition in relation to the size of the firearm, the higher the recoil will end up being. As such, you'll see that a heavy SMG has more recoil than an assault rifle, despite the latter using 5.56, which packs more punch than the SMG's 45 ACP. There is simply more weight to the assault rifle that the user can lean into to compensate for the kick. This stat and others play very heavily into the overall percentage of weapon handling in the colonist info page, so we're going to need to explain that alongside recoil for it to make meaningful sense.
Do you understand?
Yes.
Many things are going to impact weapon handling, like the shooting stat itself, traits like careful shooter, and a higher or lower manipulation stat. This goes on to impact recoil per shot, using the weapon's recoil value in a formula with this percentage as well as the weapon's natural sway. This can be further impacted by the aiming mode, but we're going to cover that in detail later. For now, let's just focus on weapon handling and how recoil plays into that. The biggest impact to weapon handling is going to be the colonist's shooting skill, with a skill of 0 leaving this value at 100%, a skill of 10 increasing it to 250%, and a skill of 20 raising it to 287.5%, because of the post-processing curve bringing the value down quite dramatically. So while the value is displayed as a percentage, it's measured by a lot of systems as a number. So that 10 shooting skill that gives you 250% is sometimes classed as 2.5. You'll find the most meaningful improvements to weapon handling occur on that path towards reaching a skill of 10, with each point between 0 and 10 offering around a 20% improvement, as skill 10 itself only grants 10% more, with these percentage increases dropping off dramatically with any further skill levels gained. For this stat, anyway. Whilst there is no way of actually seeing the recoil formula in-game, it was posted on Reddit by Drake Saint a few years back, so provided the information is still somewhat accurate to the current version, it swings from a positive to a negative number on a shot-by-shot basis during a burst, which is simulating the weapon jumping up in the user's hands as they attempt to control it by pulling it down to realign towards the target. All of this means that a weapon with a high recoil can be controlled by a user with an equally high weapon handling stat. You don't want burst weapons with high recoil on an untrained shooter. Equally, you're unlikely to want a single fire weapon on them, because they rely on that burst to land a shot or two by virtue of volume. So that means you're looking for a low recoil, high burst weapon to train up your shooters, with an experienced operator being better able to use a single shot or a high recoil firearm that typically packs more punch, thanks to larger caliber ammunition. It makes sense, right? Fingers crossed for an easier stat. Magazine capacity, oh thank god. We've already covered that ammunition is going to be a thing by virtue of weapons having different calibers and capabilities. Magazine capacity shows you how many rounds the weapon can hold and how many seconds it will take to reload to full. This isn't a super hardcore simulation either, so magazines aren't completely discarded if the weapon is reloaded when it's at half capacity, nor do bullets need to be inserted into individual magazines before combat starts. Simply carrying a couple of hundred rounds of 303 in your pocket is enough to throw 50 of them at an LMG in 4.9 seconds. The mod is involved, but it's not sadistic. Some weapons will be manually loaded, like a pump shotgun, which sees that 0.85 second reload counting each shell, whereas the chain shotgun is a magazine fed weapon, so even though its 4-second reload looks longer on paper, it's still faster for a full reload than a pump shotgun would be, with more round to boot. Some weapons, like bows, don't have a reload or magazine capacity stat. They simply work from a cooldown and aiming time, with arrows being drawn one by one as required from the colonist's inventory. Reloading speed also has its own stat in the colonist's combat information, with shooting skill and manipulation lowering it gradually as the operator gets more familiar with the location and angle of the magwell. You'll also find that a few bits of gear have benefits for this stat too, as they place extra ammunition in more convenient spots to the wearer. From here you have sight efficiency. This plays quite heavily alongside the aiming accuracy stat, so it's another combined effort like Recoil was with weapon handling, only sight efficiency is much more transparent in its numbers and calculation. Again, aiming accuracy is another one of those stats that gets walloped by the post-processing curve, so you'll see larger gains to accuracy between 0 and 10 than you will from 10 to 20, with 0 skill offering just 20% accuracy, 10 skill reaching 80% and 20 only gaining another 16.25 on top of that, to hit 96.25%. Of course, consciousness and sight will be playing a role in this stat too, but we're just going to focus on baseline for the sake of simplicity. Effective sights are doing a lot of work for the sake of calculations, helping with leading the target and planning around any bullet drop, both of which have their own calculations as well. Yes, there are even more formulas going on. The main one we want from this is against aiming, which is 1.5 minus aiming accuracy, divided by the aiming efficiency, or sight's efficiency if you will. With a weapon like a bow, they have a negative efficiency, harming this modifier, whereas a sniper rifle is going to greatly increase it. This of course again plays into low skilled shooters being able to compensate for their shortcomings with a well calibrated and clearly sighted weapon, whereas a trained sniper can make deadly use of weapons regardless of how obscure it may be to line up a shot with them. You'll find that things like handguns, something that you would have normally passed off to a low skilled shooter in vanilla, are nearly worthless on an untrained operator in Combat Extended. It isn't as simple as putting your short ranged weapons on goobers anymore because there are more calculations going on rather than just accuracy over distance. Shotguns and machine pistols are far better in an unskilled combatant's hands now, thanks to spread, clear sights and close proximity to the target. Then you have a nice easy yes/no option of if the weapon is one-handed or not. This determines if it can be wielded alongside a shield, allowing you to have frontline infantry to open doors and hold the position down with a handgun, whilst others can lean out from around cover using larger weapons. Next is spread. These are unavoidable deviations in the firearm's trajectory and can be made better or worse by the quality of the firearm, with better crafted weapons lowering this inherent spread quite dramatically. It's why these spread values aren't massive numbers, even on something like a shotgun or a handgun, because they're just unavoidable. You're already going to be fighting against accuracy with things like recoil, handling, sights, distance and target leading, so this is the small scattering of RNG that you can't math your way out of with all weapons. After spread is weapon sway, and this is where it makes the most sense to talk about aiming modes, as they're what's having the most dramatic effect on this stat, as well as covering bipods too, so a pretty big section coming up. Weapon sway is something that's difficult to avoid, from having to hold the gun steady with its weight, to fighting against natural movements like breathing, shivering or shaking from adrenaline. Some weapons are easier to keep locked into a stable position, such as a heavy SMG. It's lighter and smaller than an assault rifle with a moulded foregrip and a shoulder stock, so the user can really hug this weapon to their body and keep it as still as possible. Compared to something like a bolt action rifle, it's heavier, it's longer, it has an unbalanced firing position where even the smallest movement will drastically shift the position of the muzzle, and even pulling the trigger is going to cause the weapon to shift slightly.
Simple. Fuck.
Weapon sway is reduced in direct relation to the shooter's aiming accuracy, so someone with a skill of 10 and 80% accuracy will be lowering the sway by 20% of its value. with this sway value then coming back around to play into the shooter's weapon handling stat, so everything ties together eventually. This obviously plays far more heavily into long range shots because of how projectiles are actually drawn now, and hitboxes are something that matters. A shot deviating by 10 degrees from only a few tiles away may still clip the intended target if they were close enough, or at the very least hit something collateral, whereas 10 degrees of deviation over 50 tiles is massive, so you're looking to have these sway and spread numbers as low as possible for engagements over even a medium range. So how does this then play into aiming modes and bipod use? First, let's do bipods. Not all weapons have them. Certain guns, like the sniper rifle or LMG, will have a foldable bipod that can be deployed by the shooter if they're allowed to remain stationary for a short time. With a bipod set up, the gun's recoil, weapon sway, range, and aiming time all see a benefit, allowing the user to hit shots at far greater distances thanks to the stability of the weapon and the improved target leading. There is no downside to setting up the bipod on a weapon, as the user can simply stand up and move if needed. They're not going to be wasting time folding it back up before changing position. So if possible, it is normally better to let them set up before they open fire. Aiming modes, on the other hand, are something that everyone with a ranged weapon has access to. There are 3 potential choices here: aimed shot, snapshot, or suppress. Aimed shot is going to reduce the weapon's sway, taking an additional round of aiming time to brace the weapon before pulling the trigger. This additional round of aiming time depends on the distance to the target, so close quarters aim shots will not be as difficult to line up as something at extreme range. This mode typically provides a greater benefit to a skilled shooter over long distances. Someone with very little familiarity with a firearm isn't actually going to make very good use of the additional aiming time. They're still swaying heavily and incapable of managing any recoil, whereas a dedicated marksman taking an aim shot sees far greater benefits from the extra second or two to line up a shot. This is where Snapshot comes in. It's your standard aim fire cooldown cycle from vanilla Rimworld combat, with it providing more reliable results on close quarter engagements, as well as increasing the likelihood that a low skill combatant can actually hit something, as the approach of saturation is going to beat out precision for them every day of the week. Snapshot is also preferable for hit and run tactics. If you're trying to get some distance from enemies or covering a retreat, it allows you to split a couple of squads on alternate duties. One fires at the enemy giving chase while the other falls back, then swap roles back and forth until you reach a more fortified position, or simply exhaust the enemy. That tactic may sound like Suppression, but the aiming mode of Suppression itself is different. You'll find that more shots in CE are incapable of landing because of the game now calculating targets' height in relation to nearby cover, as well as making firing against targets in full cover impossible in some cases unless they peek around a corner. Suppression is going to allow you to fire at a target despite the shot being unable to hit anything meaningful, with an aiming time that works the same as a snapshot, forcing the target to stay hunkered and preventing them from returning fire. This is another application for dedicated fire teams, with a suppression team able to keep enemies pinned whilst others make flanking maneuvers to get a clear shot against a powerless target. Enemies will employ these aiming modes too, with them also being capable of suppressing your soldiers. It should be noted that the suppression firing mode doesn't need to be selected in order for attacks to cause suppression. It simply overrides the usual restriction on firing at targets in full cover. It allows you to keep targets in the suppressed state. The suppression meter is tied to the colonist's mental break threshold and mood, a mental fortitude check against defying self-preservation basically. You'll notice as targets take a large amount of gunfire, they begin to display increasingly more dangerously coloured symbols, from yellow to orange and then red. Targets at an orange level of suppression are considered hunkering. They're going to run for the nearest cover and lie down, making them extremely difficult to hit whilst removing their ability to return fire entirely. If someone reaches fully suppressed at red, they're forcefully panicked and will scramble to try and find better cover. Targets are easier to suppress if the projectiles they're facing are of significant danger to their health. As such, someone in marine armour isn't going to be suppressed by a hail of arrows splattering them, or buckshot, but a large group of tribals are going to hit the deck pretty fast when a mechanoid starts firing a salvo at them. One of the largest benefits to applying suppression is that it severely hampers the target's accuracy. It prevents them from using aim shots and it forces them to rely on snapshots, if they're able to return fire at all. Of course, at times, saturation fire often comes with the benefit that the targets don't get a chance to pull the trigger in the first place.
Double kill, multi-kill, mega kill, ultra kill, monster kill, ludicrous kill. Holy shit!
Nearly there now, stay with me. The last few bits in the weapon section are melee damage, armour penetration and counter parry bonus. Whilst beating someone over the head with a ranged weapon is never advisable, you'll be happy to see here that it does a bit more damage than it would in base game. After all, having someone clock you around the head with the butt of an assault rifle is hardly a friendly tap. As for counter parry bonus, we'll go over things like that with the melee section. This just leaves the bracketed ranged parts. Building damage factor is pretty self-explanatory. It's going to decrease, or in some cases, increase the amount of power that a weapon has against structures, as whilst firing a machine gun at a wall is going to cause some problems for it, a grenade launcher is more likely to get the job done. There are also two versions of this damage factor for some weapons, passable and impassable, with passable including things like barricades, tables or chairs, and impassable being walls. If a weapon only shows one of these damage factors, it's likely the case that it's going to be doing a percentage of damage to both passable and impassable structures together, counting all structures within that one modifier. We know what range is from vanilla Rimworld, with the game working on a tile system to dictate range rather than some vague estimation of meters or feet. This is one of the places that you'll want to check extremely carefully if you're new to using CE, as ranges are drastically different. Long range engagements are long, with sniper rifles reaching 75 or 85 tiles if a bipod is set up. Assault rifles now look at around the 55 tile range, making them operate on a longer distance than a vanilla sniper did. On the flip side to this, revolvers, auto pistols and shotguns are now extremely close range. Grenades are potent but terrifyingly stunted weapons too. You'll be caught off guard more than a few times by the engagement ranges of weapons and how far they're capable of reaching now. It's why sightlines, defensive positions and tactical movement are such a massive consideration. Ranged combat is deadly from both sides, and whilst you have the potential of removing entire raids from the map before they make it within even 100 tiles of your main base, some enemies won't even need to get near your defensive line to cause a problem for you, instead choosing to hold up behind a tree, chunk or a mountain and throw pop shots at your defenders whilst their allies advance, forcing you to either hunker down behind barricades for a more secure defense, or fall back to something that may be less defendable but pose less risk to you in terms of that supportive sniper fire coming in. So let's talk cover here too, as it fits with ranged combat. All humanoids in CE aren't mindlessly standing around in combat now, and whilst the game doesn't visually display it, if they're stationary and drafted, they are considered kneeling. This determines what hitboxes are visible on the target too, so you won't be able to hit a target in the legs if they are kneeling behind a barricade. Bullets don't work that way. This means that approaching enemies are easier to drop or slow with leg shots, whilst those parts still remain visible. An enemy crouching behind cover will typically have their head and upper torso exposed in combat as they lean out or over to shoot, with the head offering the potential of more lethal shots at the cost of being a smaller target, while the torso has more collateral potential, at the cost of hits to the shoulder, arms or hands not being quite as deadly. And that brings us very neatly into the range system for called shots. This system is unlocked when a colonist reaches 2.5 weapon handling, or 250%, which without any bonuses from manipulation or traits is attained at a shooting skill of 10. You can either leave targeting mode on automatic or prioritize head, torso or leg shots. This can be extremely beneficial when carrying weapons with a seriously lethal payload, but wanting to pacify a target rather than kill them, as during a prison break, murderous rage, or if you see a running radar that you like the look of, you can try and aim for the legs to hopefully bring them down by lowering their movement stats or causing enough pain. Of course, selecting your preferred target isn't a guarantee that that's where the shot is going to land. There's still accuracy, sway, recoil and the like to deal with, but you are more likely to hit around that area. unless you seriously flub the shot. So that's your shooting, a total system overhaul. Entirely new stats on your ranged weapons, ammunition types to consider, suppression, hitboxes, aim shots, and a brutal representation of penetrative wounds. Fortunately, melee isn't as deep as ranged, so we won't be spending quite so long for this section. And yes, I know before some of you immediately jump in the comments, I will be covering the toggles and options for this mod towards the end of the video. So don't panic about me not mentioning some of that stuff for the ranged mechanics that can be disabled. We'll get to that later. For melee, a close quarters engagement is actually a pretty involved affair now. In vanilla you have hit and dodge chances, with variable damage based on the part of the weapon that landed the strike. Now you'll be engaging with critical hits, parries and ripostes, as well as a rebalance to the existing systems and a more exact version of the called shots mechanic that ranged combatants have. First off, let's quickly look at the melee stats page for a weapon and see what it's changed to. You'll see that like ranged weapons, it's now broken into weapon, weapon melee, and offsets. The first weapon tag contains if it can be used alongside a shield or not. We've covered this in ranged weapons too, and shield themselves were covered in the armour section, so the upsize to shields are already a known metric. If you're going to be up in someone's face and start swinging a sharp bit of metal around their general direction, it's better to have a shield to stop their bit of sharp metal from hitting you in retaliation. The second bit is melee damage, which is given a clearer presentation of the potential attacks and their damage variation when compared to vanilla values. Whilst you might still see that overall DPS is listed in the section below, that's taking into account swing speeds too. This will let you see what a glancing blow can inflict compared to a perfect cleave. It also shows you the naming convention, and by extension the damage type of that part of the weapon. For example, if a wound says that somebody was stabbed by X's longsword, that lets you know that the attack came from the point, whereas a wound marked as slashed by X's longsword, that would have been the edge, potentially a lot more dangerous. It helps you check your own confirmation bias if you feel that a melee fighter is performing worse than you would expect. Are they actually underperforming, or is it just that the last 5 attacks they managed to land were all the suboptimal strike type, for example? Melee armour penetration factor doesn't mean how much armour each strike will penetrate. It's there to determine if the melee armour penetration values listed below receive a percentage bonus or not. This is impacted by the material choice when making a weapon. Going purely by what you'll have access to with unmodded materials, you've got wood, stone, jade, steel, plasteel, uranium and bioferrite. You'll find that wood only has 50% of the standard value. Stone, jade, steel and bioferrite have 100% penetration, plasteel goes up to 125 and uranium is king with 130%. What you might notice looking at these side by side is that material now plays no part into the weapon's raw damage. It will obviously help more of that damage get through by increasing the penetration value, but any additional melee DPS is coming from the wielder now, taking into account their melee skill, manipulation, sight, bulk and even age. Unsurprisingly, there's a reason that very few great warriors have ever made it to their twilight years, and those who do should rightly be feared. Whilst material choice won't play a part in the weapon damage anymore, quality does still matter, with higher quality weapons not only boasting a higher potential damage range, but also increasing the armour penetration factor too. The only thing quality won't change on a melee weapon is things like the offsets when equipped, so melee weapons get exponentially better. It's practically a requirement to use well-crafted weapons, whereas firearms with a high quality tend to make their damage more reliable to land instead, without necessarily increasing the damage of the payload itself. Then you have melee counter parry bonus, which feels linguistically clunky. This is another value that doesn't change with quality, and broadly speaking, this is how easy the weapon is to handle when attempting to parry an opponent's swing, taking into account things like the weapon size, distance granted from the opponent, and the suitability for that purpose. As such, axes, maces, knives, and clubs have a very small bonus, whereas a sword, and especially a spear, excels at this, given how it can keep an opponent at a solid range and slap their weapon aside when they attempt to make a swing. This is different to the melee parry chance offset in the lower section, as it's applied in the formula at a different stage, with the attacker's parry chance being multiplied by this counter parry bonus after it's been established. That leads us on to melee armour penetration, raw stats this time. You've gotten familiar with RHA and MPA, with the sharp armour penetration for a large amount of melee weapons that you can craft being noticeably stunted. So you're going to be relying on rewards like mono swords or plasma swords to get through anything above steel plate. This gives some weapons, like an axe, a bit more viability in melee combat during the early game, as whilst they lack much in the way of penetration, they do pack a wallop against blunt armour, doing better than things like Equaz or the Gladius, which can offer a higher damage potential but are stopped by even a sturdy leather. Of course, the mace is made for stoving in breastplates, and most long-bladed weapons exaggerate these traits further, with the warhammer taking the wind out of anyone's sails in a single swing, the longsword cleaving through anyone not smart enough to strap themselves in plate, and the spear able to push a little bit more penetration than the longsword at the cost of a larger cleaving damage potential that the blade offered. The jump when going to mono swords, plasma swords and Zeus hammers isn't small either. There's very little in the way of an intermediary weapon between long blade research and the ultra tech weapons. Of course, this swings both ways. A single defender with a high quality plate armour in the early game will be able to single-handedly hold a choke point against a tide of melee enemies, whilst you're free to aim weapons over their shoulder and shoot the attackers in the face, giving your meat wall a lovely case of tinnitus. Just remember that attacks dealing close to the amount of penetration required to pierce through armour will be rapidly lowering its condition, so you're going to be frequently smithing new suits if you take this approach. Although if you were to invest in a single decent suit of something made out of plasteel, it would effortlessly bounce low tier weapons off its surface without taking a scratch. Melee damage per second is similar to the breakdown that you get in vanilla Rimworld, allowing you to see things like the swing speed, the base damage before quality modifiers been applied, range of damage, and the chance of that attack being used. This is important as CE seems to weight attack preferences more sensibly than vanilla, with fighters far more likely to use the attacks you would expect them to at any given time, based off the chance factor weighting that's displayed here. This is rather than the game doing its own internal logic around what it deems the best, mid, and worst category attacks, then assigning values to those in broader categories. Fingers crossed, no more repeatedly hitting an enemy with the handle of your weapon whilst they absolutely massacre those around you. Next are all the offsets, which are going to lead into the new mechanics themselves. First up, it's critical, with most non-Ultratech weapons having wildly different values, anywhere from the 4% on a breach axe to 125% on a warhammer. Of course, the chance being over 100% doesn't mean that every attack is going to be a critical. It's going to increase the base chance of that colonist scoring one. Again, for the sake of calculations, I'm going to consider our baseline to be a melee skill of 10, given that's when the XP fall-off starts to take effect. So it becomes the floor for a skill once it's been reached, not counting any modifiers to manipulation or sight either, which is going to offset that stat. Against an equally skilled opponent, which is an incredibly important part of this formula, the starting point for landing a critical strike is 10%, with the final value reached by adding that 10% to the attacker's critical chance, then subtracting the defender's critical chance. This means if you're using a colonist that is significantly more skilled in melee than their opponent, they will steamroll them with critical strikes, whilst the opponent will have significantly reduced chances of landing one themselves. Order is extremely important when calculating this critical hit chance, as is the post-processing curve, which is going to be working against you once around a third or more of your attacks should be criticals. After the base value of 100%, you will first add any relevant traits, like Brawler that would give an extra 25%, then any percentage buffs or debuffs from the weapon that you're using, and if you have a shield equipped or not. Then all of this together gets squashed by that melee skill offset. So, to feel this post-processing curve at melee 10 without any manipulation buffs, you're going to need to hit around 160% crit to begin with. It's not impossible, it's just unlikely. As much as you'll find that crit plateaus out at a certain point, you can try and min-max it a little by making sure that the weapons with larger crit offsets go on to fighters that don't see it being squashed quite so severely by post-processing. But chances are those skilled fighters would be able to much better utilise the weapon's damage potential too. It's more of a consideration if you're crafting warhammers and longswords of your own. Do you want the higher base damage or the potential to crit more frequently and punch through harder armours? Critical hits themselves always deal the most damage possible from that swing type, with there being 3 potentials for an additional effect based on the type of damage. A sharp critical will pack twice the penetration of a normal swing, blunt critical hits will stun the target for a brief period, and if an animal lands a critical hit, it will down the defender, to simulate the beast overwhelming them and dragging them to the floor. You're going to want to remember how that critical calculation works when determining how likely this is to happen with certain animals, as something like a rhino has a massive 41% critical strike chance, making it extremely likely that they're going to stampede over any defender if it manages to reach them in melee. From there, they're going to be practically at its mercy, as it can just throw blow after blow and potentially chain knockdown effects against them. Then you've got dodge, which works similarly to base game, but you're going to find that more weapons and armour have an impact on this stat now. Again, using that baseline of 10 melee without any movement, sight, weight or bulk modifiers, this sits around 22%. Whilst I'll talk more about weight and bulk in the loadout section of this video, just know that certain heavy armours like steel plate or cataphract gear will not only have the fixed stat offsets for dodge chance reduction, they'll also be potentially lowering the dodge chance further based on how heavy or bulky it is for that individual fighter. It may potentially remove their ability to dodge altogether, which is fine provided the armour is doing its job. Remember that dodge offsets are also shown slightly differently on weapons or traits compared to how they're calculated in game. The plus 0.5 from Nimble actually translates into 50%, with a Nimble colonist at skill 10 already pushing the post-processing curve that's trying to keep dodge from creeping any higher than around 30%. As for what dodge actually does, it simply avoids an attack, negating any effect it would have had on both armor condition or health. A small thing to note with dodge is that whilst ranged combatants may have a dodge chance, they can't make use of it whilst they're aiming or firing. So if you have a nimble shooter, don't expect them to duck and dive if they're still pulling the trigger when someone reaches them. They're going to stand there like a lemon and get clobbered. That leaves us with parry, and by extension of that, riposte. Pawns can parry whilst they're unarmed. It simply has a different effect to parrying with a weapon or a shield. An unarmed parry is going to reduce incoming damage, so it works as mitigation, with the amount of reduction based on the melee skill of that colonist. Parry works with a similar formula to what critical hit used, comparing the parry chance of the attacker against the defender, with the attacker given the advantage from their melee weapon counter parry bonus. It uses a base value of 20% for parry and then works the attacker and defender skills around that, so you need to quite significantly overpower the opponent's parry chance to nullify it in this case. Obviously, something like a melee shield is going to offer a massive bonus for this chance, but equally weapons like spears can be beneficial too. It just loses that potential additional protection that a shield would have been offering against projectiles like arrows. An attack that is parried successfully with a shield or a weapon negates the damage that would have been taken by the defender entirely, and instead inflicts it on the gear that was used to make the parry. So these aren't clean deflections as such, it's more of a frantic block that sees the weapon losing a significant chunk from its edge or even fracturing the haft of it, with a shield splintering under the onslaught whilst the wearer cowers behind it. Parries themselves are a limited resource too, and whilst the values don't appear to be listed anywhere as to how many times they can be performed in combat before being exhausted, or how long they take to recharge, they are directly linked to the colonist's skill in melee combat and their attack speed, with my observations and assumptions leaning towards faster weapons being capable of more parries than larger, heavier equipment. Consider it a hidden exhaustion mechanic. At some point your shield arm is numb from all the absorbed shock, and your hands have pins and needles from that constant reverberation travelling down the weapon with every deflected blow. You simply don't have any more in the tank to lift your defense another time and just take the blow head on instead. As well as parries being able to prevent the defender from taking damage, critical parries allow for the defender to riposte and become the aggressor instead. It lets you sneak in a free attack outside of your normal rotation of swings, as the attacker has been knocked off balance and left open for a follow-up, or the swing is deflected in such a way that allows the defender to land a strike as they return their weapon to its neutral position, such as drawing the blade back across the attacker's arm. Melee combat becomes quite brutal as skills progress and more gear is supplied to your front line, with more opportunities for them to negate damage as well as armour that can mitigate it entirely. If you find that your enemies are starting to pose a similar threat to you because they're turning up in steel plate or flak gear and are reliably soaking strikes from your melee attackers whilst returning blows of their own, you might need to get down and dirty with the melee targeting system, which works similarly to the ranged one, but not identically. For starters, basic melee targeting is unlocked a little bit earlier, with a skill of 8 being enough to allow for striking at the legs, torso or head region. Swinging lower and higher comes with a reduced accuracy, on an 80% modifier for the legs and 70% for the head, as it's somewhat easier to simply step back or lean your head and duck a swing, compared to trying to move your entire torso. This does allow you to aim for potentially weaker spots on an armoured target though. For instance, if your enemy is wearing steel plate armour and a plate helmet of normal quality, their head is roughly 3.5 RHA and 5.25 MPA, with their body averaging 3 RHA and 4.5 MPA. So if you avoid the head, it's going to be easier to get through the body, with it being easier still to aim for the legs, as they're only 90% as protected as the torso. And if you swing low repeatedly, you're more likely to land blows on their hands, which counts as a low body part, so hacking towards your opponent's thighs and digits may be the best approach. It's dirty, but effective. Of course, if they only had the steel plate armour and were foolish enough not to put something on their head, then you can swing for the fences against their brain box, as a single good hit will likely be enough to bring them down, rather than trying to brute force through their armour. That isn't everything with melee targeting though, as it gets far more specific at level 16 compared to the ranged version, allowing attacks to target individual body parts. Of course, this is not going to guarantee that every hit lands in that location, just like if you aimed high, you might still hit someone in the shoulder rather than the head. There is a massive formula that goes with these specific attacks, with a large part of it being determined by body part coverage. These percentages aren't likely going to be something you know off the top of your head, and if you want to look at them to feed it into this formula and see exactly how the accuracy breakdown works, they can be found in the body parts section on a colonist information page. This will mean that aiming a strike for something as specific as an eye, whilst it may be the least armoured location, is far less likely to land where intended compared to going for the neck or the head itself. Of course, a missed swing against that specific part won't negate the attack entirely. You will still hit something collateral. This system is most effective when used by someone with a massive amount of buffs to their hit chance. Think someone with the brawler traits, with bionic arms and eyes, maybe hopped up on go juice. If you only have that one viable target on an opponent to exploit, a melee assassin might be your best chance to get the job done. So as terrifying as ranged weapons are in CE, don't sleep on blades and blunts. Fighters are more dangerous than ever thanks to the Armour Overhaul. One strong suit of armour will let them wade through hordes of enemies and Beyblade their way to victory. And that is melee. It's far less involved than ranged in terms of a complete mechanics overhaul, but it does have many new systems to play with. It's why CE leans towards that uncomfortably overwhelming sense that makes players just want to hit quit and go back to playing what they know. I used to struggle with that myself at times, especially with massive changes to systems that I already thought I knew. It still can happen to some degree. I got around this when I was learning CE interactions by running limited colonies when I started. I was going ranged or melee only. I was focusing only on a single type of combat, and it helped me understand the new strengths and weaknesses that it offered, without making every encounter feel like I was drowning in options. That being said, I was pausing more often. I was taking more time to look at the stats of gear that enemies were coming in with, I was more thoroughly scanning raids when they arrived, and I was taking more time to consider what my next research would be and what my colony needs were at the given time. I'd gotten so used to most threats in vanilla Rimworld that I rarely considered things like plate armor, or ever worried about fighting a lone mechanoid. If push came to shove, I could always beat them to death with bare hands and excessive dogpiling. Not anymore. Whilst I can't yet say that I am comfortable with CE, it's definitely sinking in more over time. I'm no longer jumping ahead in tech to grab things like drug production or transport pods, because the wealth that I'm creating means larger, more dangerous raids, and they're turning up in armour that my weapons simply bounce off of. So you're likely going to end up prioritising militarisation research, getting the best gear you can on colonists ASAP, before you settle down to make their lives more enjoyable. You can of course always buy the gear that you need instead, but with how fast you're able to recruit new colonists, it does become tricky to use this method and keep everyone equipped. Although realistically, all you need is one ridiculously strong set and a single good fighter, and that can be your entire defensive line for quite some time. Anyway, now that we're talking about gear, let's go over how the new inventory system and loadouts work. Pawns have always been capable of putting things in their pockets in Rimworld, only now it's a lot easier to manage and also far more important to utilise. There are two stats that play in with this mechanic: weight and bulk. Whilst carry weight was a thing in vanilla, these systems have been fleshed out and given an actual impact in Combat Extended. Weight is the mass of any worn gear plus any additional parts that are carried in the inventory. Weight is going to be the most straightforward of the two, as regardless of if an item is equipped or not, it counts towards weight. Just because the steel helmet has moved from a backpack into being a one on your head doesn't mean that it's lighter. Whilst that weight may be distributed more evenly, that character is still carrying that weight on their person. Carried weight impacts move speed, with there being an allowance for a certain amount of weight before the negative effects become noticeable. This means that a frontline fighter that spends their life entombed in armour is going to be noticeably slower in their day-to-day life. And all of this isn't to say that weight capacity is a fixed thing. Certain gear is going to increase a colonist's weight capacity, like power armour, meaning you're still able to move at a reasonable pace in spacer gear despite its substantial weight. So what about bulk? This value is something that's far more fluid and will see far more frequent offsets and changes. Whereas weight impacts your move speed, bulk affects work speed and melee DPS. So whilst a suit of full plate armour might be heavy, it's also bulky. It gets in the way of reaching things and it limits your mobility. But the same could be said for wearing a big puffy parka jacket, making it annoying to reach into your pockets or getting in the way of looking at what you're working at a bench. You'll find that some items have two values for bulk because of this, one simply called bulk and the other being worn bulk. Trying to stuff a parka into your backpack is a pain in the arse because now you have to dig around it to reach other things, so it's more bulky when carried in your inventory. That's the bulk value. Whereas by putting the parka on, now you don't have to fight past it every time you want to look into your bag, but it doesn't magically make it unobtrusive. It just spreads out a little bit more evenly now, so it's less bulky overall. That is your worn bulk. This is also massively affected by the weapon that the colonist is carrying, regardless of if it's currently equipped or stowed in their inventory. I found this out the hard way by having everyone using bolt-action rifles before I'd made backpacks for them. So my entire colony's global work speed was reduced to around 85 or 90%, and that brings up another thing to go with bulk: backpacks. Certain existing gear has seen some stat tweaks, and there are other new items available in CE that will help offset weight and bulk stats, with the most obvious things being backpacks or tactical vests. Not only are you going to find these new bits of equipment insanely useful for bumping up bulk capacity, allowing you to more easily use bigger, chunkier gear, but you're also going to notice that these are working on new slots, so you aren't having to give up the use of a utility item or a standard layer of equipment either. Wearing parts like this will allow your colonists to properly stow their magazines, grenades, secondary weapons, medicine or drugs, making it much quicker to grab when needed and staying out of the way when they aren't. No more dumping loose rounds, syringes full of go juice and a bowl of cooked rice into their pocket and then blindly plunging their hand into it, hoping they grab the right thing.
Ow, pointy! You slimy. Oh, moving. Uh-huh.
This of course means there can be a little bit more micromanagement to combat too, with colonists able to carry supplemental grenades in their inventory that they can swap to on the fly. You no longer need a dedicated grenadier. It's something that can be shared across multiple combatants. This also gives you the flexibility to actually make use of some of the thrown weapons that you may otherwise neglect, such as carrying a couple of Molotovs, a spare EMP grenade, a flashbang, or even a fire foam for emergencies. It can be extremely useful to preemptively soak a room in fire foam when a drop pod raid turns up and attempts to start an inferno. Of course, needing to constantly select colonists and direct them to pick up these items or rearm themselves once they've used their supply would be ridiculously tedious. This is where loadouts come into play. Loadouts are separate from outfits, in that outfits dictate what someone is allowed to wear, compared to a loadout that's determining what they will attempt to fill their pockets with. As you've seen with my rundown on compositable loadouts, it's a little bit like that, without the option of layering preferred equipment. One of the main things you're going to need to get used to is telling colonists to carry enough ammunition for their weapon of choice, as well as any alternative types that you may wish to use, such as keeping a decent amount of full metal jacket on hand for day to day, with a couple of magazines worth of AP for any seriously armoured targets that may show up. These loadouts can be as generic or as complicated as you would like, and you can save as many as needed and update them whenever you wish, with it being as simple as using a colonist to manually fill their inventory with what you want them to keep on hands at all times, and then hitting the Make a Loadout button on their gear page. For instance, when I started out a ranged only colony, I was using Range Basic and Range Medic. The Basic contained a hunting rifle, a meal, 50 rounds and some yayo, because of course I was using wasters. The Medic loadout was identical, only it told them to pick up 5 medicine too. These loadouts can be rearranged, as the order determines what they will prioritise picking up first. So you likely want that medicine at the top of the list for the Medic, whereas any additional types of ammunition could be left quite low in the list if they don't have the space for it. It isn't the end of the world as long as they're carrying something to load into their gun. This also automates colonists changing weapons too. Let's say you've gotten a little bit further into the game and have ranged long, mid and short loadouts. The short ranged colonists are now set to move over from pump shotguns to chain shotguns. Swapping this weapon in the loadout will see all of the colonists with this loadout set, returning their weapons to storage and grabbing their new boomsticks. The only bit you might want to keep an eye on is that they are grabbing the highest quality weapons in your possession, as you don't quite have that level of fidelity when creating the loadout. There's no minimum condition or quality value that can be assigned. This is now also where you can start diversifying what additional equipment people are carrying, even going as detailed as making individual loadouts on a colonist by colonist basis. You can carry a backup weapon too, so if your long-ranged combatants are unlikely to get close enough to throw a grenade, they could instead carry a disposable rocket launcher, or even a backup weapon like a machine pistol for when targets drop into your base and render their sniper rifle near useless. Of course, you still need to balance all of this out around their bulk capacity and carry weight, so you're unlikely to want to clutter your close range combatants with dozens of grenades and additional firearms, as it's going to make it harder for them to cover the distance to get into combat, or move between cover without being noticed.
Please remove any metallic items you're carrying, keys, loose change. Holy shit!
This loadout and inventory system also allows you to do things like share ammunition in firefights. If you've had a couple of soldiers caught out of position and they've been running and gunning their way back to the base, they might be a little bit light on rounds by the time that the enemy make it to your gates. Anyone carrying ammunition can be selected and then ordered to give that ammo over to another colonist with a simple right-click menu command, either in bulk or as a set amount. This even allows you to do emergency supply runs if the threats that you're about to face are turning up with more armour than your weapons are capable of handling with their current payload. so you don't need to pull the entire fire team away from a fight, only 1 or 2 people that have a decent amount of space in their backpack to fill with emergency AP rounds that can then be distributed across everybody when they return to the front line. Again, it's gonna get a little bit micromanagey if you play this way all of the time, but the importance is that you recognise it's a valid option in combat now. Just because the defense seems impossible doesn't mean you have no options. You just might need to think a little bit outside of that vanilla box and come around to the methods that CE is offering you. That about covers it for loadouts, weight, bulk, and the interactions around it. And I've gone through this entire rundown talking about things like ammunition, backpacks, and new gear without really covering its production. So that's going to be this section. A little bit of everything around the new tech, new gear, changed gear, and any additional mechanics that have been introduced alongside them. So let's talk about the most obvious thing first then. Ammo crafting. Different ammunition types are produced in various locations, such as basic arrows, javelins, or improvised explosives being available at the crafting spot or smithy, with the smithy also allowing for forging of more advanced arrowheads or crossbow bolts. Whilst fletching arrows can be a little bit tedious and time intensive, they are what's known as reusable projectiles, which gives a chance after they've been loosed to potentially be recoverable, scattering the ground with missed or bounced arrows after a long engagement. So, whilst there is the potential to get through a fair chunk of plasteel if you wanted to make truly dangerous arrows, you might get more value out of each shot than it initially looked on paper. There are also things like venom arrows or flame arrows. If these miss or bounce off a target after striking them, they become a standard steel arrow instead, of either great or normal size as applicable, with venom arrows applying an effect that's quite similar to toxic buildup when it's landed successfully, passively accumulating over time for each venomous wound on the target, and flame arrows working like a flame bow projectile from biotech, only with you being able to pick which bow they're now fired from, expanding the range capability that they offer. The loading bench is the new workstation that's going to fulfill the need for most standard weapons. It produces all manner of cartridge and shell. It's unlocked at the gunsmithing research, so whilst you can buy ammo from traders or send caravans to pick some up from a friendly town, if you want to make your own and have a reliable supply, this is the tech that you need to get started. Ammo is made in pretty massive quantities for a relatively cheap cost, in comparison to arrows anyway, with it needing very little work in terms of a single cycle's output. For example, 500 303 rounds are only going to take 28 steel, and it's the same cost for full metal jacket, AP or hollow point variants. This makes it extremely easy to set up a do until X bill for your ammo, ensuring you've always got a good chunk on your shelving so that you're never going to run dry, with it only taking 1 or 2 crafting cycles to totally resupply an entire firing line, at that stage of the game anyway. This is where paying attention to the caliber of ammunition of your weapons is important, as whilst you can certainly scavenge weapons and a couple of spare mags from raiders, using these weapons without either a crafting build to resupply them or a hefty stockpile already set aside can lead to firefights that see your colonist running dry and then standing around idly in the middle of a gunfight. Obviously, not all ammo types are just going to use steel though. More exotic recipes are going to require things like cloth, chem fuel, uranium, components, or some new ingredients, FSX or Promethium. We'll dig into these after this section as they are extremely relevant to crafting speciality ammo and weaponry. Whilst the loading bench is doing a lot of heavy lifting with standard firearms, you're going to find that your explosives and mortar shells are still produced at the machining table. The cost for any of these parts that are shared across multiple benches, like Molotov cocktails, are identical. They're just faster to produce at a power bench, because electric tools are going to make it easier to tie off a rag in a bottle of 80 proof alcohol. What you'll notice quickly with CE is that component costs around things like shells are going to absolutely rinse through a stockpile. A standard HE shell in vanilla is 15 steel and 15 chem fuel. 5 mortar shells in CE is setting you back 54 steel, 10 FSX and 2 components. This means if you've gotten a bit comfortable using large overwhelming salvos of mortars in vanilla, you'll find it far more costly to translate that approach into CE. On the flip side of that, Mortar shells in CE are absolutely terrifying, but we've got a section coming up with changes to mortar rounds and high projectiles in a little bit, as there are more changes to that than simply the damage numbers. That still isn't everything ammo production wise though, as we've covered arrows, bullets and explosives. It leaves charge rounds which are made at the fabrication bench. Given the nature and need for all of those additional components and ammunition that requires it with CE, you're likely going to have a need for at least 2 fabrication benches in your base by the time you reach this point to split the workload, if not more. Otherwise you're going to find it extremely difficult to find the time to work on things like bionics, implants or top tier armour without constantly being interrupted. This is another place where you're going to see that ammunition absolutely chews through components, with charge rounds also taking plasteel too. Not only that, but some of the rounds that are produced here are specifically for mechanoid weapons, which means, yes, if you're using a mechanator to run a robot army, it's going to be incredibly tanky against most damage types, thanks to the changes in CE, but it's also going to be significantly more expensive to upkeep. It makes things like scythers a lot more appealing, as they can just get in, do their job, and come home to have any dings and dents fixed. Fortunately, if you're not going to be able to make use of that mechanoid ammo yourself, but still find that they're dropping it on your tile once killed, you do have the option to recycle the ammunition and reclaim some base resources that can then be repurposed into a more useful form. It makes mechanoid raids extremely lucrative, with bodies being shredded, the slag being smelted, and any ammunition broken back down into components as well. Just remember, there's a reason that they're so generous in these rewards. The risk is a lot higher. This also can painfully drill in the fact that you need to be familiar with what ammunition your weapons are actually using, as the last thing you want to see is that you've made thousands of 8x35mm charged rounds only to discover that's actually used in blaster turrets, not the charged rifle. So now you've got yourself a bunch of spacer tiered soldiers with nice shiny laser weapons that they have to use as the world's most expensive maces. It also shows how some of the standard vanilla weapons have not only been changed, but removed from where you'd expect to find them. You're only getting the charge rifle with pulse charge munitions now, and whilst the lance is still in the game, it's not something you're going to be making for your own soldiers. If you're also using Anomaly and have things like the Hellcat rifle and Incinerator, you're going to need more than simple chem fuel to refill their tanks now, with the drug lab producing the ammunition that they require. So Combat Extended is going wide with its production requirements at times, and that's only covering the base mod itself. If you consider all the recommended mods to pair alongside it, armors, armory, attachments, guns and melee, it gets incredibly dense. It's why I'm only covering the core mod with this rundown, because by itself, CE is already a little overwhelming. I get the feeling if someone installed this with all the recommended expansion content before having even dipped their toe into its pool of mechanics, they'd develop PTSD and never touch this mod again. As a very brief aside on these expansions, you get what you'd expect by the naming conventions that they use. However, without them installed, you're still going to see tech unlocks and content included with the base CE mod that you can't actually make any use of. The ammo unlocked in gunpowder tech, for example, isn't used by any weapons that are available to you. Unfortunately, they won't show up in any crafting menus because of this. So you aren't going to be horrifically bloating all of your workbenches with needless crap. The same can be said with all of the additional ammo types that go unused in advanced ammunition. Winchester rounds, Springfield rounds, so many types of Magnum ammo. I covered this mod with the additions disabled for a reason. I can't imagine it's that convincing if I'm telling people the mod isn't actually that overwhelming if you take your time with it, whilst showing footage of endlessly scrolling through hundreds of different ammo types in a never-ending workbench menu.
Snotty car. This is indecipherable.
Look! It is perfectly simple. None of that. Or any of the others.
So we have all the places we can craft ammunition. What about these 2 resources that we need then? FSX and Promethium. FSX has a few methods you can use to acquire it. Obviously both of these materials can be picked up through trade, it kind of goes without saying. What you'll see now is that Boomalopes and Boom Rats have 2 different production percentages on their information panel, milk fullness and secretion level. It's a really cheeky way of making this mechanic work too. with the FSX technology working like shearing a woolly coat, but renamed to appear as something else, its secretion level. So these animals are now far more valuable in terms of the trade goods that they are passively producing for you. The FSX takes longer to produce and comes in much smaller quantities, with a single successful harvest from a Boomerlope scoring you 6 FSX every 10 days, compared to the 110 chem fuel it would have made in that time. FSX can also be synthesized if you don't want to ranch or trade for it, with 100 chem fuel producing 8 FSX at the biofuel refinery. So if you weren't making use of a Boomerlope's chem fuel for anything else, it is producing roughly 14 FSX with this refining process included. In terms of how much that translates over to, 5 standard mortar shells needs 10, although you could make 100 rounds for the grenade launcher for just 8 FSX, and a few extra steel and components of course. So how much bang you're getting for your buck is pretty variable, with things like stick bombs being a clear example of that. They cost just 13 wood and 20 cloth, but need a whopping 20 FSX for 10 of them. Of course, if you're messing around with a low-tech tribe and have access to Boomerlopes, these weapons are readily accessible to you and can make a crazy difference when faced with Mechanoids or an armoured raider. That leaves Promethium. Whereas FSX is your high explosive component, Promethium is a condensed incendiary. This method of acquisition is dangerous and extremely temperamental. You're going to need to plant blaze bulbs if you want to grow this material yourself, with the crop requiring a skill of 6, taking around 12 days to reach maturity in good conditions and yielding 3 Promethium with a successful harvest. Now comes the hard part. Blaze bulbs self-ignite if exposed to temperatures that exceed 28 degrees. Not only do they spontaneously burst into flame, when they're damaged they also leak puddles of Promethium as well, which also ignites when it comes into contact with air. This is why I had to remove one of my mod settings that made Boomerlopes bleed chem fuel, as chem fuel puddles have been changed to Promethium in CE and my butcher was setting themselves on fire constantly. So a plant that's occasionally bursting into flames if it gets too warm, or gets hit by a stray projectile, and is most likely surrounded by other plants that are extremely flammable. Growing blaze bulbs outside of a temperature regulated hydroponics farm is, as you would imagine, pretty damn hard, but it's not impossible. Just make sure to keep the fields of them far away from your other crops, or even better, encircle the field with stone walls, to prevent the fire from spreading further than its immediate area, as once a single plant starts, the whole field is essentially forfeit, but you don't need to throw away everything around it too. It also helps if you put a steel door leading into the field so that you can forbid colonists from attempting to extinguish it. They simply will not win against a lake of Promethium fire.
I know. Yeah. Okay. Subject: fire. Dear Sir Stroke Madam, I'm writing to inform you of a fire which has broken out at the premises of... No, that's too formal.
So we've got new materials, new ammo, let's cover some new security options, which is the main area that CE expands on with its base mod in terms of structures. You won't find anything in the way of new furniture, power, floors, recreation, temperature, but you do have a new type of wall and a lot of gun emplacements. The new wall then, the Embrasure, which I definitely haven't mispronounced my entire life until I double checked how to say it for this video. If you compare it side by side to a normal wall, you'll see that it's got its cover height listed. Yes, that's another new stat for Combat Extended. It's 3.5 on the normal wall and 1.23 on the Embrasure. This ties in with how cover height affects what shots are actually possible, both in terms of people that have fallen prone and are now considered fully concealed, making them completely untargetable, or trying to aim for the lower body when someone has taken cover behind this structure. These do provide more cover than a sandbag or a barricade, at the cost of having a viewing port that can limit certain firing angles, meaning targets will be able to circle around embrasures and avoid the field of fire, if they're smart anyway. On the flip side to that, things like manhunters or melee opponents can't climb over an embrasure like they could sandbags. It doesn't matter if you're dealing with one man hunting rat or 50 pissed off grizzly bears, firing at them from behind the safety of an embrasure wall will completely nullify any threat that they pose to you. This leads into a much more defensive building style very early with CE installed, because combat is absolutely lethal at the start of a colony, before people have any armour, decent weapons or proficiency to make good use of them. You can't afford to let some seemingly trivial enemies get close to you and get a bunch of free hits in. So you have a couple of options. Either have someone play the role of bait, which is risky as they may take a stray round in the process of running about, or build a solid wall with some embrasures and tuck your base firmly against some natural cover, expanding outwards as your colony grows and slowly claiming more ground within your perimeter walls. I can already hear some asking, why not just put a few of these on the side of your big starting room and then hide inside? Embrasures don't count as a full wall for the sake of insulation, which means items stored inside a room that has an embrasure as part of its wall still count as being left outside, leading to item deterioration. It also causes problems with things like insulation and the surroundings counting towards that type of room, as technically everything is outdoors. If you can't get a quick wall up, perhaps you're in a biome that lacks easy access to wood, or stone cutting's taking too long, or there's just no natural cover that you could use to get rid of a flank or two, you're most likely going to want to use pillboxes instead. These are small structures with good sightlines on all sides that allow your colonists to pile in and fire back out from relative safety, although embrasures by themselves may not quite be enough to keep those inside safe for a few reasons. Firstly, any enemies that can make it up to an embrasure essentially have free reign to place their weapon through the viewport and pull the trigger. If they're carrying a grenade or an incendiary weapon, this can end extremely badly for you. As well as enemies being able to use embrasures against you if they can close that distance, it doesn't nullify ranged threats either. In some cases, it may make them more dangerous. A talented marksman taking aim at a colonist using an embrasure for cover has a pretty limited targeting option, with one of the biggest and most obvious targets being the head. So whilst fighting in open ground is not the suggestion here, if the enemy outranges or outguns you, their shots are far more likely to be lethal than yours are. It might be better to fall back and face them in a more favourable position. Embrasures are also extremely vulnerable to enemies that turn up with a breaching explosive, like a rocket launcher, as even if the blast is deflected by the base of the embrasure, the tiles behind it are going to take significant damage, so they aren't a solution for everything. You want to pair them up with other defensive options to try and mitigate this variety of threats where possible. Consider lining the outside of embrasures with sandbags or barricades to potentially intercept additional projectiles, meaning explosives won't spill over inside the box and the embrasure itself won't take quite as much damage from continuous fire, with some of it being mitigated by that outer layer of defense. You can go even further and build another of the new security buildings, Barbed Wire, as an outer layer to all of this. Barbed Wire is unlocked from smithing research and it costs 1 steel and 1 wood or metal per tile placed, so it's pretty cheap to slap down wherever you need it, with the bonus from it using something like metal instead of that piece of wood quite minimal, as it's still a relatively fragile building to begin with. It's also ridiculously fast to build, so you can easily add these in the direction that you need to if an enemy is preparing to attack. And whilst Barbed Wire itself offers nothing in the way of cover, it makes the terrain that it's placed on extremely difficult to traverse, so it's going to stop enemies running up to your sandbags that you place outside your embrasures and prevent them from using it as cover, leaving you with a 3-layer thick defense that protects you from most threats. Of course, none of this is going into the kind of shenanigans you can set up with kill boxes and exploiting the in-game AI, but you all know that I'm far more of a fan of using a traditional defense and a dedicated kill zone instead of exploiting pathfinding or having enemies mindlessly walk through rows and rows of traps. Some of these security options you're already going to know. They'll now also feature mechanics similar to a ranged combatant, such as an ammo need and swappable firing modes. Obviously turrets don't have an inventory like colonists do, so they need to be manually reloaded by someone as they run low. And whilst keeping ammunition nearby does save a little bit on legwork, it's also extremely dangerous as rounds can be cooked off if hit by stray shots or purposefully targeted by explosives. This can potentially see a dangerous shower of bullets scatter in all directions, causing chain reactions if multiple stacks of ammunition are stored together. You'll notice that raiders downed by burn damage often drop their weapons and ammunition, only to spread fire to it and frequently be eviscerated when it reaches the magazine. It turns out laying practically face first on top of a fragmenting explosive isn't conducive to survival. As well as having your standard automated security turrets, you now also have options to make use of manned emplacements. The KPV machine gun, the AGS-30 grenade launcher, and the 90mm flak turret. These give you great flexibility with ranged defenders, allowing colonists that are armed with mid or short range weapons to instead use a stationary weapon whilst the enemies approach, so they aren't waiting around idly for them to reach the effective range. Nor do they need to fill their inventory with multiple weapons and risk running around with a high weight and bulk. Again, these guns do need manually reloading, with some having a far greater capacity than others. You aren't exactly going to get many rounds off with the 90mm flak gun before the approaching force is on top of you. Although, given that thing's size, even a single round fired from that weapon is normally enough to make the difference in terms of evening the numbers out. One of the changes to existing security structures is on the rocket swarm launcher and mortar. These can now target world tiles, either to prompt a retaliatory attack by the inhabitants or to assist during a raid. However, if you want to make use of this feature in a meaningful way, as in being able to actually target a specific place rather than the general area on the world map, you're going to need to make use of some new gear, the Binoculars and Radio Pack. This is also a great time to talk about the changes that have been made to high projectiles and how this gear features into that. Firstly, and I know it sounds really stupid to say, but high projectiles now actually go up. You don't get to watch a projectile eject from the barrel of a mortar and sail directly over to the group of waiting raiders anymore. When a mortar fires, that shit goes up. So now you get to watch as what goes up must come down, with explosives reaching their apex, slowly turning in the air and then rapidly descending on their target. And yes, it looks beautiful when a full salvo goes out. As well as these projectiles now being more correctly rendered when they're fired, they explode in a very different way to a vanilla shell. Gone are the days of the set tile explosion radius. Now you have the direct impact and a shrapnel effect that scatters far and wide, maiming anyone unfortunate enough to be caught in the vicinity. The damage itself, armour penetration and amount of shrapnel is of course going to vary round by round, with each security option having a variety of payloads. If we take the old faithful mortar, you've got 9 potential rounds for this alone, with some more interesting additions like airburst shells. Whereas a normal HE shell has its initial devastating impact, the shrapnel that it releases tends to go all over the place, making it somewhat unreliable in terms of its area damage. Yes, it will hit multiple targets, but the potential that it scatters it over is huge. Compared to an airburst shell that is sacrificing the big punch from the shell itself to better control where that shrapnel lands, aiming it more directly over a target area rather than having the random outward spread. It's why you're typically using more of that FSX for mortar shells than you are grenades. Whilst hand grenades do have some pretty insane fragmentation potential, launching 40 shards on detonation, they're all extremely low penetration and are more likely to ricochet, causing a splattering of bruises and cracks on defenders as long as they're wearing even simple plate for protection. Compared to the basic HE mortar shell that's throwing out 25 small bits of fragmentation as well as 16 larger shards that pack around 9 times the amount of blunt penetration. It's strong enough to get through even cataphract armour with relative ease. It's not always the blast you need to worry about anymore. So how does this relate to binoculars and a radio pack? Well, these emplacements are naturally pretty limited in their sighting capabilities, impacting a quite severe accuracy penalty to the colonist that's manning the mortar, even if they're a fairly proficient marksman. This can be ignored through a mechanic known as artillery direct fire, which needs the target to be in what is considered sniper range with an unobstructed sightline, so around 75 tiles with no high walls in between. Anything outside of that is still going to have the major accuracy penalty applied to it for indirect fire. So now that you're able to have a colonist fill a role of a spotter and call in fire support, the binoculars work like a ranged weapon. They fire, in big air quotes, a dummy bullet that marks the target it hits with a shot designation. This is then radioed back to any operators that are manning mortars, and it removes the hefty indirect fire penalty, allowing for more accurate bombardments. Not only that, if the shooting ability of the colonist marking the target is higher than the mortar operator, it instead uses the more skilled colonist stats, allowing you to open combat with a salvo of deadly mortar fire regardless of the shooting capability of the colonists on the mortars, as long as you have one spotter that's proficient. Of course, the radio that comes with the Lucky Spotty is only a short-range walkie-talkie, so you need to unlock microelectronics if you want to craft a full-on radio pack. This allows a spotter to transmit coordinates over a long distance when used in conjunction with binoculars. This is what unlocks the ability to aim high-fire projectiles at exact locations on a distant tile. So if you're raiding a nearby base or dealing with a world quest, one decent spotter can realistically just call in fire support and have the artillery take care of that threat for them, although you might still want a bit of backup to make sure you've got caravan capacity to bring loot home, if it didn't all get blown to crap anyway. This is obviously a pretty specialised bit of kit. It might not be something that you can consistently make use of with every colony, or ever really need to. If you're rocking other mods that add more dangerous threats to the world map, this can be invaluable though. It's also really handy to poke the bear every once in a while if you're sat twiddling your thumbs waiting for something to happen, allowing you to forcefully trigger a retaliation from another faction, potentially bringing you more loot, new recruits, organs, or just letting you test out your defences. After all, live targets do make for the best sample data. Now, whilst I could go into all of the new gear included with CE, side-by-side comparisons, etc., the majority of this is going to work in a way that's already familiar to you. Medium, heavy, charge blaster auto turrets, they're just mini turrets with more deadly weapons on top. The full plate helmets, armor vest, composite vest, and powered exo frame, we've covered armor and the values that these impact, so just a little bit of time looking at the information screen should let you know what you need to from this. I don't need to go into exacting detail over this stuff because I've given you the understanding of the framework and how it works now. There are, however, a few bits that operate a little bit differently in CE compared to vanilla, and one of those things is how light impacts combat. Vanilla has this strange quirk where you gain an accuracy bonus as long as you're stood on an illuminated tile, whilst targets stood in total darkness suffer a penalty, which means a squad crouching in total darkness trying to ambush a group that is stood underneath a lamppost are actually at the disadvantage, despite their targets being lit up like a Christmas tree. You'll be pretty happy to hear that this is corrected in CE. An illuminated target is easier to hit, and one stood in darkness is far harder to accurately aim for, and best of all, you're given the tools to play with this mechanic.
Bravo 6. Going dark.
As well as night vision goggles providing a bonus to this efficiency stat, you'll also find it on bionic eyes, spacer tier helmets like the Recon Marine and Cataphract, as well as the dark vision gene now granting a massive bonus to this stat too. It makes striking from the shadows a viable strategy, especially if you're able to exploit enemies by outranging them, because even if they do manage to get close enough to start getting shots of their own off, by that point you've whittled down their numbers that a retreat is pretty close to happening and they're still firing blind at you, but not quite as blindly as you might think. Muzzle flash is also taken into consideration with CE as well. So single fire weapons very briefly illuminate the shooter, but continuous bursts from a rapid fire machine gun will fully expose the shooter to far more accurate return fire. You need to consider when planning your weapon choice for a nighttime engagement around this, if you're going to try and exploit night vision tactics anyway. Hit and run with a bolt action rifle might do you better than spray and pray with an SMG in that case. It's not the only mechanic that has seen a pretty impactful overhaul either, as you might now notice items like gas mask and spacer helmets also have an offset to smoke sensitivity. This isn't the blinding smoke from your normal smoke grenades or pop packs though. This smoke is caused by fires in enclosed spaces, shown as black smoke in ppm, parts per million. Smoke inhalation is no joke in CE, with infernos raging in a wooden base no longer just posing a risk from heatstroke, but also causing colonists to pass out from a lack of oxygen before barbecuing whatever was left of them. This black smoke also spreads outwards, creeping into other rooms and dispersing slowly when it reaches an area that is unroofed. So a compound style base with a large central inferno will have it spilling out an extreme distance before it begins to dissipate. It's going to be quicker to clear if you tell your colonists to remove the roof and make a chimney of sorts. When the ppm reaches a high enough level, smoke inhalation will rapidly down a colonist, far quicker than heat stroke would, dropping their consciousness, breathing and blood pumping. So this isn't something they'll collapse from and be able to crawl away. If they're down, they're pretty much screwed. It can cause this nasty spiral where colonists seeking to rescue someone who has collapsed from smoke inhalation will suffer the same fate themselves, and you end up with a whole colony left helplessly on the floor as the flames creep around them. The downside to putting a gas mask on to avoid this is that other stats are negatively impacted whilst it's worn, applying a whole body health effect. It drops sight by 10%, eating by 50%, talking by 15%, and it increases how quickly they get tired by 10%. So you don't want these on at all times, but they're light and small enough that they can be held in the inventory for emergencies, allowing you to quickly mask up your defensive line if raiders employ either incendiaries or toxic gas against you. The other new item of note is a new drug, Psycho. It's made using 16 psychoid leaves per dose, and it's an extremely potent combat drug with a crippling downside. It's available to all colonies at either the crafting spot or the drug lab. Whilst it does have a stronger effect than other psychite based stimulants like Flake or Yayo, the crash that it causes means it's not really a choice for a scheduled dose or suitable to treat a psychite addiction. At the peak of its high, it lowers pain and suppressibility to 10%. Tiredness drops to 33%, and it also increases consciousness by 15%, sight by 20%, and movement by 33%. The effect of this trickles down in strength as it reaches closer to the end of its duration, and when the high completely clears, the colonists will instead be hit with the crash debuff. At its initial stage, this causes 10% pain and lowers consciousness to 70%, progressing to major with 30% pain and an unreal drop to just 40% consciousness, finally easing off with a recovery stage of 10% pain and 80% consciousness before disappearing entirely, with the time it takes to recover from this crash phase lasting over twice as long as the duration of the high. So whilst this drug is a more accessible go juice substitute for many colonies, you really need to consider how many people are taking it at once. As for the next 48 hours, they're going to be considerably less productive. Not good if you're already facing threats like bad weather or starvation. And that about covers everything. I did want to briefly go back to Mechanoids before wrapping up the video, because outside of adding in other modded threats of course, they're pretty much the big bad danger in CE. Mechanoids can very easily end an entire run if you aren't prepared. Even if you are prepared, things can still go bad extremely quickly and scatter your plans to the wind. Whilst I'm sure this isn't exactly a surprise as to why they're so dangerous, they're running the deadly combo of being highly armoured, extremely durable, and lethal in combat efficiency. Their charged weapons will shred through basically anything that isn't made out of plasteel, with flat gear barely mitigating most shots, and pikemen using horrifically cruel Sabo rounds that will punch a hole clean through even marine gear.
What can men do against such reckless hate?
This is where some people are really going to bounce off CE, because combat isn't always clean. People get maimed, colonies are nearly razed to the ground or have to be abandoned entirely. Death is an ever-present danger, far more so than in vanilla Rimworld. If you're someone who prefers playing on reload at any time settings, and you find yourself typically saving before combat to replay a fight until everyone makes it through alive, CE is probably going to really frustrate you. Colonists will get jacked up constantly when real dangers start appearing, and not everyone is going to have the same attitude that I do towards Calamity in Rimworld, in that I just tend to laugh it off. To me, watching a colony go down in flames could be just as entertaining as seeing them do extremely well, if not more so, because it's the last gasp, their final stand. It can really punctuate a colony's story to have a memorable end. So in terms of finding things memorable and mechanoid threats in CE, let me share a story with you as to what my first real encounter was with them. I'd started as tribal. I was using a ranged only approach to get a feel for the new weapon ranges, the kind of quantities of ammunition that colonists would need to carry, and I was looking a bit more exclusively at armour penetration and testing the values around it, using the bow and arrow. The colony was doing alright, not well, but they were surviving. We had a couple of bouts of near starvation because I was too busy looking at numbers, there were a couple of bad diseases, but other than that, things were ticking along fine. About a year and a bit into the colony, bear in mind that we're at the level of smithing and I'm working on complex clothing and Devil Strand. A defoliator ship lands on my map and it has a single lancer to defend it. That's it, one lancer. I look at the stats on it and then back at my weapons. Whilst my great bows can put a dent in it with steel arrows, it's only if we land incredibly lucky shots against its most vulnerable parts. 99% of the shots we take will either miss or harmlessly bounce off. So I know I'm going to have to ignore this defoliator ship, and that just doesn't sit right with me. It's sitting there barfing out pollution and it's making a mess. And then, a few days later, I see someone appear on the horizon. A war merchant from the Gentle tribe. Whilst I know their weaponry is about equal to mine in terms of technology, they've got twice the number of bodies that I do. And I'm thinking, if I can get in quickly and loose an arrow to wake the Lancer up, they're going to dive in and fight it for me. Boy was I wrong. When the Lancer woke up, shot after shot from their crappy short and recurve bows either harmlessly sailed by it or comically dinked off it. Whilst the javelins they were throwing did manage to inflict a crack or two in its armour, they ran out of projectiles long before enough damage had been done. And those foolish enough not to hide behind cover and try to charge in with a melee weapon dropped almost instantly when a shot punched a hole clean through their torso, scoring damage against organs in the process. It was, by all definition, a massacre. And I hid. I saw that all of this was going on and felt something that I hadn't felt for a very long time in Rimworld. Genuine fear. Whilst we technically had more layers of protection than these guys, it was still made out of random leather. There was nothing sturdy enough to actually slow a shot down in any meaningful capacity, and to get anywhere near it we had to cross 32 tiles of its range before we were in range to take a shot of our own, during which time we'd be in the open, the easiest targets for it to go for at its preferred distance with no cover. I genuinely didn't know what to do at this point. The tried and tested method of let the caravan deal with it would normally work on everything, from the ancient danger to a thrombo appearance, and it failed against a single mechanoid. It's not even a strong mechanoid, it's a foot soldier. I'm looking at what I have access to. There's no FSX or Promethium for stick bombs or molotovs, even plasteel great arrows aren't going to be enough. I could cobble together some maces and we could try and beat it to death, but we don't have the luxury of time anymore as now I've pissed it off. And even then, it'd still be able to get a shot or two off as we tried to rush it. Fortunately, the storyteller thought things needed a bit more spice and decided to send a raid my way. 6 wasted pirates that wanted to attack immediately. Whilst most had revolvers or auto pistols, a single one of them was carrying a bolt-action rifle. They proceeded towards my base before one of them was absolutely brained by the Lancer. A single shot that damn near took their entire head clean off. As they scattered for cover to engage with the Lancer instead of me, the tribe was now doing their best to flee, with quite a few of their members painstakingly crawling across the ground to try and reach the edge of the map. Now the shots that the Lancer makes are being mitigated, somewhat, but not entirely, as the wasters with their close range weapons are charging headfirst in, taking shot after shot with horrific injuries that see them bleeding out in just a few hours, but that sneaky bastard with the bolt action rifle is tucked behind some nice sturdy cover, leaning around the edge of a mountain and firing shot after shot with no interruption, each one progressively dealing more damage as the Lancer's armour begins to give way under this continued pressure that's been piling on it. Then finally the last shot rings out as it destroys the Lancer's thorax, leaving behind a battered and dented pile of scrap. Only now I'm thinking, great, I've got multiple threats to deal with that are wearing flak armour and using guns. Only as they turn and begin moving towards my base, one of them drops from blood loss, then another, and a third, and the other 2 turn and flee. 3 prisoners for me, and I've got the freedom to move around my map again. So why did this stay with me so vividly when realistically I played next to no part in that story myself? At the risk of possibly making it sound a little bit too reductive, it's pacing. Vanilla combat can feel like a slugfest at times, even with high quality weapons and armour, because of the somewhat random nature of how attacks and defence are calculated. There's always this break point that you're aiming for where damage tips over from being dangerous to lethal, which is when fights become essentially brainless. You line your guys up, enemies walk into their range, and then you focus fire everything down until they turn and run. Rinse, repeat. Sure, shots might be being mitigated, limbs may be lost, but ultimately everything falls down one way or another. Combat's this dull metronome ticking back and forth. Give damage, take damage, give damage, take damage, and eventually it becomes a steamroller that flattens everything in its path. Compare that to CE. A single well-prepared soldier can make all of the difference in an entire engagement. It's no longer this metronome ticking. You have a baseline, a chorus, a crescendo. Enemies arrive to attack you and colonists run to man mortars. Your baseline starts, that familiar thump, 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 droning across the battlefield. You've got your reliable Overwatch fire from a team that are armed with long-range weapons, sniper rifles or hunkered behind a KPV. That spattering of hi-hat starts. Your enemies are charging towards you with blood-splattered armour and fury in their eyes. Then the main event kicks off. Assault rifles sing in a chorus of bullets, ricocheting trying to find soft targets, whilst the enemy plays a war hymn of their own. Discordant voices are screaming across a battlefield until silence. Only smoke and death remains. The screams of those who weren't granted the mercy of a clean death. It's fast, it's brutal, and it highlights those key players in a fight. Those who turn up dressed from head to toe in power armour and have shrugged off all but the most dedicated assault that was thrown at them. You learn to prioritise targets, as whilst you may not be able to bring everyone down, you can certainly make people panic as their allies lay broken around them. So, compared to where I started with my thoughts around CE, do I still agree with them? No. I was wrong, and there's no shame in admitting that. Whilst I don't think this mod is for everybody, as I can see too many occurrences of annoyance for some players, you are literally facing impossible odds at some point, and knowing that there is basically nothing you can do to win isn't a feeling I imagine most people are going to enjoy. I do see how this mod has earned its place in the upper echelons of the Rimworld modding legacy though. It's bold, ambitious, and it does what it set out to do extremely well. While CE may not play well with others at times, I honestly don't think you need it to. It refreshes the base game in such a way that with only some quality of life fixes and a few cosmetic changes, I didn't mind the lack of content that I'd grown accustomed to. You don't need hundreds of modded firearms when a single weapon with different ammunition types does the job of all of them. It adds and removes bloat at the same time in this strange roundabout way. But in talking about ammo, there is that one final thing to mention. The options. And if you're on the fence because of some of the systems in CE, this might change your mind. You have a few cosmetic options in here, like shell casings or recoil animations, combat taunts, that kind of stuff. But you can also enable or disable some of the larger mechanics too, turning this into a CE Lite system. Armour can be set to only have one value across its entire coverage, so things like eyes or fingers are no longer weak points. You can entirely disable the black smoke if you found it too annoying to try and rescue colonists from blazes. You can enable colonists to shoot faster with each subsequent shot, simulating that they're getting their eye in when locking onto a target and needing less time between re-aims. You can disable the entire ammunition system if you'd like and keep guns at a very base value, going back to a more vanilla style of only needing a weapon and it has infinite ammo. This does, however, remove the option to use specialised ammunition. If it's the specialised part of the ammunition system that you don't like, you could disable that instead, keeping just base ammunition available for each weapon, so ammo counts and carrying extra mags still matters. It's a nice middle ground. If you don't like the landscape being scattered with missed or bounced arrows, you can turn off reusable projectiles. It saves your colonists the legwork in collecting them. You can even toggle if bipods are automatically used or disabled entirely. So It's not only good at what it does, it's flexible too. It's nice that these toggles are included as standard and they aren't something you need to dig through the workshop to find a patch for. And whilst I'm sure there are hundreds of patches on the workshop to toggle or tweak things, this covers the majority of issues. And with all of that said, I think we're done. What an absolute beast of a video. Thanks for waiting for me to get this one out too, as it's taken a lot of work and a hell of a lot of revisions to get the pacing to a place that I was kind of happy with. If you've noticed the audio has changed a few times throughout the video, you've picked up on where I've either re-recorded a section or cut something out entirely. There's quite a few bits in there, so fair play on your ears if you manage to pick up all of them. If you'd like to see the current suggestion list for upcoming rundown videos, it's available to view on my Patreon. All of the posts there are completely free to read, and it's pinned at the very top of the page. I update it about once a week or so with any new recommendations that have been left in my comments, so if you'd like to support me in producing content, you can do so for just £1 a month. It gets your name in the credits for videos like this, and it helps me stay alive. Thanks for watching, folks. If you have any mods you'd like to see a full breakdown for, or suggestions of mods you'd like to see covered, feel free to leave them in the comments, I might get around to them. I'll be back again soon with another Rimworld mod rundown. Wherever you are in the world, enjoy the rest of your morning, afternoon, or evening. Take care.